"I can work, sir," she begged, the cowboy said. "No, you can rest beside me." When Clara Wynne collapsed into the arms of a stranger on the desolate Wyoming frontier, she never imagined those strong hands would change her life forever. One woman's desperate plea to earn her keep, one cowboy's unexpected answer that defied everything the harsh West demanded. What happened next became a love story that would echo across generations. Stay with me until the end and comment your city below so I can see how far this tale of survival and second chances travels across the world. The sun hung low and merciless over the Wyoming territory, turning the endless expanse of prairie grass into an ocean of gold and copper. It was the kind of beauty that could break a person's heart, vast, indifferent, and utterly unforgiving to those who wandered through it unprepared. The Oregon Trail stretched like a scar across the landscape, marked by wagon ruts so deep they seemed carved by the hands of God himself. This was 1868, a year when the West was still wild enough to kill you and civilized enough to make you believe you might survive it. Clara Wynne had believed that once. She didn't anymore. She stumbled forward, each step a negotiation between her body's desperate need to collapse and her mind's stubborn refusal to let the wilderness claim another victim. Her dress, once a respectable blue cotton that her mother had sewn with careful hands, was now a tattered brown thing, stained with dust, blood, and the residue of wood smoke from fires that would never be lit again. The hem dragged through the dirt, collecting burrs and thorns like bitter souvenirs of her journey. Her honey-colored hair, which had been neatly braided when her family's wagon train departed from Missouri 3 months earlier, now hung in tangled ropes down her back, streaked with ash and grime. The attack had come at dawn, 4 days ago. Or was it 5? Time had become as fluid as the heat waves shimmering in the distance, bending and warping until Clara could no longer trust her own memory. She remembered the sound first, a war cry that split the morning silence like an axe through wood. Then the thunder of hooves, the screaming, the impossible speed with which everything she knew had been torn apart. Her father had pushed her behind a water barrel, his weathered face suddenly young with fear. "Stay down, Clara. Whatever happens, you stay down." Those were the last words he'd spoken to her. She'd obeyed, pressing herself into the dirt while the world exploded around her. When silence finally returned, a silence so complete it felt like deafness, she'd emerged to find the wagon train destroyed. Bodies lay scattered across the prairie like discarded dolls. Her father, her mother, her younger brother Tommy, who had turned 12 just a week before, and who had been so excited about seeing Oregon, about starting fresh in a place where the trees grew so tall they blocked out the sky. Clara had walked away from that scene with nothing but the clothes on her back and a canteen that was already half empty. She'd walked because staying meant dying there among the ashes and the dead. And something in her, some kernel of stubbornness inherited from her father's Swedish blood, refused to grant the wilderness that satisfaction. Now, that stubbornness was nearly spent. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, each breath a small agony in her parched throat. The canteen had run dry yesterday, or the day before. She couldn't remember. The sun felt like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders, and her vision kept tunneling, darkening at the edges before snapping back into painful clarity. She knew these were warning signs, knew that her body was beginning to shut down, conserving resources for organs more vital than consciousness. But she kept walking because walking was all she had left. The prairie stretched before her in endless repetition, the same clumps of sagebrush, the same rust-colored dirt, the same distant mountains that never seemed to get any closer. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals in lazy spirals, and Clara found herself envying its freedom. To see the world from above, to understand the pattern of things instead of being trapped in the endless, ground-level monotony of survival. That's when she saw it. At first, she thought it was another hallucination. She'd been having them for the past day. Visions of her mother's kitchen back in Missouri, the smell of fresh bread, Tommy's laughter echoing through rooms that no longer existed. But this vision didn't fade when she blinked. A structure, maybe a mile distant, where the prairie began to roll into gentle hills. Not a mirage born of heat and desperation, but something solid, something real. A ranch. Clara's heart, which had been beating in a slow, defeated rhythm, suddenly surged with something dangerous, hope. She'd learned over the past days that hope was more dangerous than despair because hope required energy, required the willingness to be disappointed one more time. But she couldn't stop it from flooding through her veins, couldn't stop her feet from moving faster, her cracked lips from forming a word she hadn't spoken in days. Please. The distance that had seemed like a mile revealed itself to be crueler than that. Perhaps 2 miles, perhaps 3. Each step became a battle. Her vision began to tunnel again, and this time it didn't snap back as quickly. The edges of the world grew soft and dark, as if she were looking through a telescope that someone was slowly closing. Her foot caught on a rock, and she stumbled, barely catching herself on her hands. The impact sent shockwaves of pain through her palms, which were already raw and blistered from her days of walking. Get up, she told herself. Get up, Clara Wynne. Get up. She got up. The ranch resolved itself into distinct features as she drew closer. A main house, weathered but sturdy, built from logs that had been carefully chinked against the Wyoming winters. A barn, its red paint faded to a dusty rose by years of sun and wind. Corrals holding horses that looked like they were carved from sunlight and shadow. And movement, blessed, beautiful movement. A figure near the barn, tall and lean, working with focused attention on something she couldn't quite see. Clara tried to call out, but her voice had abandoned her somewhere in the last mile. All that emerged was a rasping sound, barely louder than the whisper of wind through the grass. She pushed forward, her entire world narrowing to that single point of civilization, that promise of help, of water, of survival. She was perhaps 50 yards from the house when her body finally decided it had carried her far enough. Her legs simply stopped working, folding beneath her like paper dolls. The ground rushed up to meet her, and in that moment, suspended between standing and falling, between survival and surrender, Clara found herself thinking about her mother. About the way she used to sing while churning butter, old Swedish folk songs that Clara had never learned the words to. About her father's hands, scarred and capable, always building something or fixing something or creating something from nothing. About Tommy's gap-toothed smile and his collection of interesting rocks and his absolute certainty that Oregon was going to be paradise. Then strong arms caught her, stopping her fall with a certainty that seemed impossible. The world tilted, and she found herself cradled against someone's chest, her face pressed against fabric that smelled like leather and sage and something clean, something human. "Hold on, miss." The voice was deep, steady, with the kind of calmness that only came from a man who'd seen enough trouble not to panic when it arrived. "I've got you. Just hold on now." Clara tried to respond, tried to explain about the attack and the water and the walking, but her tongue felt thick and useless in her mouth. Her eyes fluttered, catching glimpses. A strong jaw covered in several days' worth of dark beard, eyes the color of rain-washed slate, a face that might have been handsome if it weren't so grave with concern. "Water," she managed to croak out. "Please. Going to get you water right now, miss. Going to get you fixed up. You're safe now. You hear me? You're safe." Safe. The word seemed impossibly foreign, a sound from another language, another life. Clara wanted to laugh or cry or explain that nowhere was safe, that safety was an illusion people told themselves while the world waited to show them otherwise. But darkness was pulling at her consciousness, patient and persistent, and she was so tired of fighting. She let herself fall into it, trusting, for the first time in days, that someone else would catch her. When Clara woke, the first thing she noticed was softness. For days, she'd known only hard ground and harder walking, her body a catalog of aches and bruises. But now she was lying on something that gave beneath her weight, cradling her body with impossible gentleness. A bed. She was in a bed. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to lamplight that seemed bright as the sun after days of harsh daylight and cold nights. She was in a small room, simply furnished but clean. A window showed darkness beyond. Night had fallen while she'd been unconscious. The walls were log construction, chinked and sturdy, and a braided rug covered the wooden floor. A rocking chair sat in one corner, and atop a simple dresser, a wash basin and pitcher waited with practical efficiency. Clara tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Her head swam, and every muscle in her body screamed protest. She'd made it perhaps 3 inches off the pillow when a voice stopped her. "Easy now. You've been out for near about 6 hours." She turned her head, slowly, carefully, and found the source of the voice. The man who'd caught her stood in the doorway, holding a tray that bore a bowl of something that sent steam curling into the air. In the lamplight, she could see him more clearly. He was probably in his early 30s, tall and lean in the way of men who worked hard for their living. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling around his ears and the collar of his shirt. The beard she'd glimpsed earlier was neatly trimmed now, but it was his eyes that caught her, gray and steady, with a kindness in them that seemed at odds with the hardness that frontier life usually carved into men. "Who are you?" Claire's voice came out as a rasp, and she winced at the sound of it. "Name's Elias Griffin. This is my ranch." He moved into the room with careful, deliberate movements, setting the tray on a small table beside the bed. "And before you start worrying, you're perfectly safe. I've got a housekeeper, Mrs. Whitley, but she's visiting her daughter in town for a few days. You've got my word as a gentleman that you've got nothing to fear under this roof." The formality of his speech, the careful way he maintained distance from the bed, the openness of his explanation, all of it spoke to a man who understood how vulnerable a woman alone in a strange place might feel. Clara felt something in her chest unclench slightly. "I'm Clara," she said. "Clara Wynne. Miss Wynne." Elias nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement. "Think you can sit up a little? You need to get some food and water in you. You're dehydrated something fierce." With his help, his touch gentle but impersonal, supporting her shoulders while she shifted against the pillows, Clara managed to prop herself into a sitting position. The room spun briefly before settling. Elias handed her a cup of water, and Clara had to force herself to sip it slowly when every cell in her body screamed to gulp it down. "Small sips," Elias coached, watching her carefully. "I know you want to drink the whole thing, but your stomach's probably pretty empty. Too much too fast and you'll just sick it back up." Clara obeyed, though it took every ounce of willpower she possessed. The water was cool and clean, and it felt like life itself flowing down her throat. After she'd finished half the cup, Elias handed her the bowl, a simple broth, clear and fragrant with herbs. "It's just chicken broth," he explained. "Nothing heavy. We'll work you up to real food once your stomach remembers what it's for." Clara ate in silence, and Elias stood by the window, giving her privacy while remaining close enough to help if she needed it. The broth was the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted, not because it was particularly special, but because she was alive to taste it. Each spoonful was a small miracle. When she'd finished as much as she could manage, Elias took the bowl and settled into the rocking chair, maintaining that careful distance. In the lamplight, with his hands folded and his expression patient, he looked like a man prepared to wait as long as necessary. "Do you want to tell me what happened to you?" he asked gently. "Or would you rather rest first?" The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes, the first tears she'd allowed herself since the attack. She'd been too busy surviving to cry, too focused on the next step and the next breath to let herself feel the enormity of what she'd lost. But here, in this quiet room with this quiet man, the walls she'd built to contain her grief began to crack. "My family," she started, and her voice broke. She took a breath, steadied herself. "We were on a wagon train, heading to Oregon. We were attacked. 4 days ago, I think, maybe 5. Everyone—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Elias's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes grew darker, heavier. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "That's a hard thing. The hardest thing." "I walked," Clara continued, needing suddenly to explain, to make him understand. "I just kept walking. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay there." That took courage. Clara let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so bitter. "It wasn't courage. I was just too stubborn to die." Sometimes stubbornness is its own kind of courage. Elias leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "You're alive, Miss Wynne. That counts for something." They sat in silence for a moment, the lamplight casting gentle shadows around the room. Clara could hear night sounds through the window, crickets singing their endless songs, the soft whicker of a horse from the barn, the whisper of wind through grass. Peaceful sounds, living sounds. "What will you do?" Elias asked finally. Do you have family somewhere? People who will be worried about you? Clara thought about it, sorting through the wreckage of her life for something solid to hold on to. My mother's sister. She lives in Boston. We weren't close. Aunt Margaret thought my parents were foolish to go west, but she's family. Boston's a long way from here. Everything's a long way from here. Clara looked down at her hands, at the bandages she now noticed wrapped around her palms. You cleaned my wounds. Had to. They were starting to fester. Nothing serious, but out here you can't be too careful. Elias stood, moving to the wash basin. I can write to your aunt if you'd like. Let her know you're safe. The next supply wagon to town isn't for a few days, but we can get a letter on it, have it sent east. I don't even know where I am, Clara said, and the admission felt like revealing weakness. You're about 30 miles southwest of Fort Bridger. The ranch is called the Griffin Holding, though that's fancy talk for what's really just a stubborn patch of land and some good water rights. Elias dampened a cloth in the wash basin and brought it to her. Here, for your face. You've got trail dust about 3 layers deep. Clara took the cloth and pressed it against her face, feeling the cool dampness cut through the grime. The simple act of washing felt impossibly luxurious. When she lowered the cloth, it came away brown with dirt. I can pay you, she said suddenly. Not right now. I don't have anything. But I can work. I can cook and clean and mend. I can... Miss Wynne. Elias held up a hand, his voice still gentle but firm. You're not in my debt. You don't owe me a thing. I can't just take your charity. It's not charity. It's being human. He moved back to the doorway, giving her space again. Right now, you need to rest and heal. We can talk about the future when you're stronger. I'm going to let you sleep now. If you need anything in the night, I'm just across the hall. Don't hesitate to call out. He was almost out the door when Clara's voice stopped him. Mr. Griffin, thank you for saving my life. Elias turned back, and for the first time she saw him smile, just a small curve of his lips, but it transformed his face, softening the hard edges that the frontier had carved into it. You're welcome, Miss Wynne. Sleep well. Clara woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of someone moving around beyond her door. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was, her sleep-fogged mind expecting to hear her mother humming in the kitchen or Tommy's off-key whistling. Then memory crashed back, and with it the weight of loss. But there was also relief. She was alive. She was safe. She was in the ranch house of a man named Elias Griffin, who had caught her when she fell. She sat up slowly, testing her body's capacity for movement. Everything ached, but it was the manageable ache of overused muscles rather than the desperate agony of the day before. The water and food and rest had begun their work. On the chair beside the bed, she found a clean dress laid out, simple blue calico, worn but well mended. Next to it was a hairbrush and a bar of soap that smelled faintly of lavender. Clara rose carefully and made her way to the wash basin. Someone, Elias presumably, had filled it with fresh water. She washed as best she could, scrubbing away days of grime until the water in the basin turned gray. Her reflection in the small mirror above the dresser showed a stranger, hollow-eyed, painfully thin, her skin sunburned and peeling, but alive, unmistakably alive. The dress fit reasonably well, if a little loose in the shoulders. Clara wondered whose it had been, but pushed the question aside. She braided her hair with fingers that shook slightly from weakness and hunger, and then, taking a deep breath, she opened the bedroom door. The main room of the house was larger than she'd expected, open and airy with windows that let in the morning light. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel bare except for a clock and a few books. The furniture was simple but well made, a table with 4 chairs, a sitting area with a worn sofa and 2 armchairs, shelves filled with more books than she'd expected to find in a frontier ranch house. The place was clean but clearly lacking a woman's touch, functional rather than decorative, organized with military precision rather than homey comfort. Elias stood at the stove, his back to her, doing something with a cast-iron skillet that sent the smell of bacon wafting through the room. He'd clearly been up for hours. His hair was damp from washing, and he was dressed in clean work clothes. When he turned and saw her, surprise flickered across his face. Miss Wynne, I didn't expect you to be up yet. I've imposed on your hospitality enough without sleeping the day away. Clara said, her voice still rough but stronger than the night before. "It's not even 7 in the morning, and you nearly died yesterday. I'd hardly call sleeping late an imposition." Elias gestured to the table. "But since you're up, sit. I'll get you some breakfast. Nothing heavy, just some bacon and bread. Your stomach needs time to adjust." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could help, but her body chose that moment to remind her that standing upright was still a somewhat ambitious undertaking. She sank into one of the chairs with more force than grace. Elias brought her a plate with 2 strips of bacon and a slice of bread spread with butter. He also set down a cup of coffee. Real coffee, dark and fragrant. Clara stared at the meal as if it were a feast. "Go on," Elias encouraged, settling into the chair across from her with his own plate. "Eat." The bacon was crispy and perfectly salted. The bread was fresh, baked today, probably before dawn. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead. Clara ate slowly, savoring each bite, while Elias maintained a companionable silence. He didn't hover or watch her eat. Instead, he focused on his own meal, giving her the dignity of privacy while remaining present enough to help if she needed it. When they'd both finished, Clara started to reach for the plates, but Elias shook his head. "You're still recovering. I'll clean up." "Mr. Griffin." "It's just Elias. No need for formality out here." "Elias, then." Clara folded her hands on the table. "I meant what I said last night. I can work. I can earn my keep while I'm here." Elias stood and carried the plates to the wash basin. For a moment he didn't respond, his attention apparently focused on the mundane task of cleaning. Then he turned, leaning back against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest. "Why do you feel the need to earn your keep?" The question caught Clara off guard. "Because I'm not a charity case. Because I won't be beholden to anyone. Because I've got nothing left but my pride, and I'll be damned if I let the wilderness take that too." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with the anger that had been building beneath her grief. Anger at the senselessness of the attack, at the injustice of survival, at a world that kept turning even when your entire life had been destroyed. Elias studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes thoughtful. "I understand pride, Miss Wynne. I do. But I also understand that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is let themselves be helped without conditions attached." "You don't understand." Clara heard her voice rising and struggled to control it. "I need to be useful. I need to have purpose. If I just sit here and rest and let you take care of me, I'll—" She stopped, unable to articulate what she feared, that she'd fall apart, that she'd have time to think about what she'd lost, that the grief would swallow her whole. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed to the table and sat down again, his movements deliberate and unhurried. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "All right, I hear you. But here's the deal. You can help around the house, but only when you're strong enough. No pushing yourself until you're sick again. And you accept help when you need it without arguing. Those are my terms." Clara met his eyes, searching for pity and finding only respect. "Those are reasonable terms." "Good." Elias stood again. "Right now, I need to check on the horses and mend a section of fence that came down in last week's storm. That'll take me most of the day. You should rest. And before you argue, resting means reading or sitting on the porch or doing any of the other 100 things that don't involve work. Understand?" "I understand." "Good," Elias said again. He retrieved his hat from a peg by the door, a weathered Stetson that had seen better days, and settled it on his head. At the threshold he paused. "There's books on the shelf if you want them. Help yourself to anything in the kitchen. And Miss Wynne, you're safe here. I want you to really hear that. Whatever happened out there on the trail, whatever you're afraid of, you're safe here." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Clara alone with the morning sunlight and the gentle sounds of a ranch coming to life. The days developed a rhythm. Claire would wake to find Elias already gone to his morning chores, a simple breakfast left warming by the stove. She'd eat, then spend the morning doing small tasks, mending clothes, straightening the already straight rooms, preparing lunch. In the afternoon, she'd rest, often on the porch, where she could watch the prairie stretch away in all directions, gold and green and impossibly vast. Elias would return for lunch, and they'd eat together, their conversations brief but comfortable. He'd tell her about the fence repair, or the new colt in the barn, or the weather patterns he'd learned to read in the Wyoming sky. She'd tell him about the books she was reading from his surprisingly extensive library, classics like Dickens and Shakespeare, newer works like Whitman's poetry. They didn't talk about her family or her past. Elias seemed to understand that grief needed time before it could be examined too closely. In the evenings, after dinner, they'd sit by the fireplace, Elias in one armchair, Clara in the other, and he'd read aloud. His voice was perfect for it, deep and steady, bringing the words to life in a way that made Clara feel like she was somewhere else, someone else. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and just listen, letting the stories carry her away from the memories that waited in the darkness beyond the firelight. On the fourth day, Clara woke feeling stronger. Her body had stopped aching. The blisters on her feet had healed to tender new skin. The sunburn had faded to a light tan. She could move without deliberate care, could think without exhaustion clouding her thoughts. She decided it was time to actually earn her keep. When Elias came in for lunch, he stopped short in the doorway. The house had been transformed. The dust that had accumulated in corners was gone. The windows gleamed. The wooden floors had been swept and scrubbed. Fresh wildflowers, gathered from the field behind the house, sat in a jar on the table, and the smell coming from the stove made his stomach growl audibly. "Miss Wynne, it's stew," Clara said, not turning from where she stood at the stove. "Nothing fancy, just beef and vegetables and some herbs I found in your garden. I hope you don't mind that I used your supplies." "I don't mind." Elias removed his hat and hung it on its peg, his eyes still taking in the transformed room. "But I thought we agreed you'd take it easy. I'm feeling much better, and I told you I need to be useful." Clara ladled stew into 2 bowls and brought them to the table. "Besides, you've been working from dawn to dusk. The least I can do is make sure you have a proper meal waiting." Elias sat, still looking slightly stunned. He took a spoonful of the stew, chewed thoughtfully, and then looked up at Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read. "This is good, really good." Clara felt a flush of pleasure that surprised her. When had she last felt proud of something as simple as cooking a meal? "My mother taught me. She believed that if you were going to do something, you should do it right." "Your mother was a wise woman." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. Then Elias set down his spoon, his expression turning serious. "Miss Wynne, Clara, I want to be clear about something. You helping around the house, cooking, cleaning, that's fine if it makes you feel better. But I want you to understand that it doesn't change anything. You're not working off a debt because there is no debt. You're welcome here, work or no work, for as long as you need to be here." Clara looked down at her bowl, her throat suddenly tight. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me. I'm nothing to you." "That's where you're wrong." Elias's voice was quiet but intense. "You're a human being who needed help. That makes you something to me. It makes you something to anyone with a conscience." Clara looked up, meeting his steady gray eyes. "Not everyone out here has a conscience." "No," Elias agreed. "But some of us try." A week after Clara's arrival, a letter came. Elias brought it back from town, where he'd gone to pick up supplies and mail the letter Clara had written to her aunt in Boston. He handed it to her at dinner, and Clara felt her stomach drop when she saw the handwriting on the envelope. "It's from my aunt," she said unnecessarily. "You don't have to read it now if you don't want to." But Clara did want to, or rather, she needed to. She broke the seal and read the letter while Elias discreetly busied himself with clearing the table. "My dear Clara, I received your letter with great shock and sorrow. The loss of your parents and dear little Thomas is a tragedy beyond words. I can scarcely believe that my dear sister is gone, and in such horrible circumstances. You must come to Boston immediately. I have already made arrangements for your journey. There is a stage that runs from Fort Bridger to the railroad. I have enclosed funds for your passage, as well as train fare from Nebraska all the way to Boston. Mr. Richards, a business associate of my late husband, will be traveling west in 2 weeks' time and has agreed to escort you on his return journey. Clara, you must understand that the frontier is no place for a young woman alone. You need family. You need stability. You need to be in civilization where you can properly mourn and then begin to rebuild your life. Boston can offer you everything you need: society, security, perhaps even a suitable match when sufficient time has passed. Please do not argue with me on this matter. I know you have your father's stubborn streak, but sometimes stubbornness must give way to sense. You have been through an ordeal that would break most people. Come home. Let me take care of you. Your loving aunt, Margaret Ashford. Clara read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and set it on the table. Elias, who had been pretending to not watch her, finally sat down across from her. Bad news? My aunt wants me to come to Boston. She's made arrangements, escort, travel funds, everything. That's good, isn't it? You said you had no one else. I know. Clara stared at the folded letter. She's right. Boston is the sensible choice. I can't stay here forever living on your charity. I need to build a life, and that life certainly isn't going to be found on a Wyoming ranch in the middle of nowhere. Elias was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. When would you leave? 2 weeks. There's a man, a business associate of my aunt's, who'll be passing through and can escort me east. 2 weeks, Elias repeated. He stood abruptly and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening prairie. That's not much time. Clara felt something twist in her chest. The thought of leaving, of trading this quiet, peaceful existence for the noise and crowds and expectations of Boston, made her feel hollow. But what choice did she have? She couldn't stay here indefinitely. Elias had his own life, his own concerns. He didn't need a permanent house guest, no matter how useful she tried to make herself. I know, she said softly, but it's for the best. You've been more than kind, but I can't impose on you forever. Elias turned from the window, his expression unreadable in the dim light. What if it's not an imposition? What? What if you stayed, not as a guest, not as someone working off a debt, just stayed? Clara's heart began to beat faster. Elias, I can't just live here. People would talk. It wouldn't be proper. There's about 30 people within a day's ride of this ranch, and most of them have seen enough of life not to judge too harshly. And Mrs. Whitley comes by twice a week. That's chaperone enough for anyone with sense. He moved back to the table, his hands gripping the back of the chair. Clara, I've been alone on this ranch for 5 years. 5 years of eating meals by myself, sleeping in silence, talking to horses because there's no one else to talk to. Then you show up, and suddenly this house feels like a home instead of just a place to sleep between work. The food tastes better, the evenings feel shorter, the mornings feel like something worth waking up for. Clara stood, her legs suddenly unsteady. Elias, I'm not asking you to stay forever. I'm not asking for anything except that you think about whether Boston is really what you want, or if it's just what seems proper. Think about it, Clara. That's all I'm asking. He left then, stepping out into the night, leaving Clara alone with the lamplight and the letter, and a decision that suddenly seemed far more complicated than it should have been. The next 2 weeks passed with a strange, bittersweet quality. Clara found herself noticing things she'd taken for granted. The way the morning light streamed through the kitchen windows, painting everything gold. The sound of Elias's voice when he read in the evenings. The absolute silence of the prairie at night, broken only by wind and the occasional coyote's call. The sense of peace that had slowly, steadily seeped into her bones. She caught herself thinking about Boston less as a destination and more as an obligation. Aunt Margaret meant well, Clara knew that, but Boston represented a return to a life that had never quite fit her, even before the wagon train west. The social expectations, the careful propriety, the sense of living in a box built by other people's rules and assumptions. Here, on the ranch, she could breathe. She didn't speak to Elias about his proposal. They both seemed to silently agree to let the question hang in the air, unanswered and unexamined. Instead, they simply lived, working, eating, reading, existing in a companionship that had become as natural as breathing. But time was a relentless thing, and the day came when Elias returned from town with news. Mr. Richards arrived in Fort Bridger yesterday, he said over dinner, his voice carefully neutral. He'll be at the Turner Ranch tomorrow afternoon. It's about 2 hours' ride from here. He's expecting to leave the day after, so if you're going to go, you'll need to ride over with me tomorrow. Clara set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. Tomorrow. Yes. That's sooner than I expected. Time moves fast out here. Elias pushed food around his plate without eating. If you want to go, I'll take you. If you want to stay, I'll ride over and tell Richards you've changed your plans. The moment had arrived, the choice laid bare. Clara looked around the room, at the curtains she'd hemmed last week, at the flowers she'd put in the window, at the book lying open on the side table, marking the place where Elias had stopped reading the night before. She thought about Boston, about Aunt Margaret's careful concern and the life of respectable widowhood that surely awaited her there. Safe, proper, predictable, empty. She looked at Elias, really looked at him, saw the tension in his shoulders, the careful blankness of his expression that couldn't quite hide the hope and fear warring in his eyes. This man who had caught her when she fell, who had cared for her without expectation or demand, who had given her space to heal and purpose to live in companionship that asked for nothing but her presence. Boston may have comfort, Clara said slowly, but it doesn't have purpose. Elias's hand stilled on his fork. What are you saying? I'm saying that I've spent my whole life doing what was proper and expected, following the rules, making the sensible choices. And where did it get me? Watching my family die while I hid behind a water barrel. Clara felt tears burning in her eyes but refused to let them fall. I don't want to be safe anymore, Elias. I don't want to be respectable. I want to be alive, really, truly alive. And I feel more alive here, in this ranch house in the middle of nowhere, than I've felt anywhere else. Clara. His voice was rough with emotion. So no, I won't be riding to the Turner Ranch tomorrow. You can send my regrets to Mr. Richards and my apologies to Aunt Margaret. I'm staying here. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and promise. Elias stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor, and for a moment Clara thought he might embrace her. But he simply nodded, his eyes bright with something that might have been tears. All right then, he said softly. You'll stay. I'll stay. Good. He cleared his throat, visibly composing himself. Then we should probably discuss the practical matters. Mrs. Whitley's been wanting to come by more often, says the house needs a woman's regular touch. If she comes by 3-4 times a week, that should satisfy anyone concerned about propriety. And the ranch, well, it could use another heartbeat, another purpose. Clara smiled, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. The ranch could use another heartbeat. Is that your way of saying you want me here? Elias met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd known him, he smiled fully, a real smile that transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. Yes, Clara. That's my way of saying I want you here. Very much. They stood there in the lamplight, the remains of dinner forgotten, two people who had found each other in the midst of tragedy and wilderness and impossible odds. Outside, the Wyoming night pressed against the windows, vast and dark and full of stars. Inside, in the warm glow of the fireplace, two hearts began the slow, careful process of learning to beat in tandem. Clara had come to this ranch broken and lost, seeking only survival. But she was staying for something far more precious, the possibility of belonging, of home, of a future built not on expectations and propriety, but on choice and courage, and the quiet strength of two souls who had learned that sometimes the best thing you can do is simply catch someone when they fall, and trust them to catch you in return. The morning after Clara's decision dawned clear and cold, the kind of Wyoming autumn day that promised winter wasn't far behind. She woke to the sound of Elias moving around in the main room, the familiar rhythm of his morning routine now as natural to her as her own heartbeat. But this morning felt different. Everything felt different. She had chosen to stay, had spoken the words aloud, and in doing so had committed herself to a future she couldn't quite see but wanted desperately to discover. Clara dressed quickly in the blue calico that had become her daily uniform and braided her hair with fingers that trembled slightly. Not from fear exactly, but from the weight of what she'd done. She'd turned her back on respectability, on family obligation, on everything a proper young woman was supposed to want. And somehow, that felt exactly right. When she emerged from the bedroom, Elias was at the stove, his back to her, his shoulders tense in a way that told her he'd been awake most of the night thinking. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and their eyes met across the room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. I need to ride to the Turner Ranch this morning, Elias said finally, his voice careful. To tell Richards you won't be joining him, and to collect some lumber Jim Turner's been holding for me. I could come with you, Clara offered. It seems cowardly to send you to deliver my refusal. Elias shook his head. No need for that. Besides, I think you being there would just make things more complicated. Richards is likely to try to convince you otherwise, and your aunt has probably given him a whole speech about duty and propriety. Clara smiled despite herself. You know my aunt remarkably well for never having met her. I know the type. Elias poured coffee into 2 cups and brought them to the table. Besides, it'll give you time to write her a proper letter, explaining your decision in your own words. That's better than secondhand news from Richards. They sat together in the early morning light, drinking coffee and not quite looking at each other. The easiness that had developed between them over the past weeks felt suddenly fragile, as if Claire's decision to stay had shifted something fundamental in their relationship. They were no longer simply host and guest, no longer patient and caretaker, but what they were now remained undefined, hanging in the air between them like a question neither was quite ready to answer. I should be back by early afternoon, Elias said, finishing his coffee and standing. Mrs. Whitley's coming by around midday to discuss her new schedule. I told her you'd be here. What did you tell her? About me staying? Elias paused, his hand on his hat. I told her the truth, that you're a woman who survived a terrible tragedy and needs a place to heal, that the ranch has room for you, that it's the decent thing to do. He settled the Stetson on his head. She didn't ask questions. Mrs. Whitley's good that way. After he left, Clara found herself restless. She cleaned the breakfast dishes, swept the already clean floors, and finally settled at the table with paper and pen. The letter to Aunt Margaret needed to be written, but the words felt impossible to find. How did you explain to someone who valued propriety above all else that you'd chosen to stay with a bachelor rancher you'd known for barely 2 weeks? That you'd chosen uncertainty over security, wilderness over civilization, feeling alive over feeling safe? She began 3 different letters, wadding up each attempt and starting over. Finally, she forced herself to simply write from the heart. Dear Aunt Margaret, I received your letter and your generous offer with deep gratitude. I know you mean well, and I know you believe Boston is the right choice for me. Perhaps for many women it would be. But I have discovered something about myself in these past weeks. I am not the woman I thought I was. The tragedy that took my family also broke something open in me. It showed me that life is shorter and more precious than I ever understood. That safety is an illusion. That propriety and social standing matter very little when you're walking through the wilderness wondering if you'll see another sunrise. I have found purpose here, Aunt Margaret. I have found peace. Mr. Griffin's ranch is not a prison or a scandal. It is a place where I can breathe, where I can rebuild myself into someone stronger than I was before. Mrs. Whitley, a respectable widow from town, will be here several times a week. My reputation will remain intact. I know this is not the choice you would make for me, but it is the choice I am making for myself. I hope, in time, you will understand. With love and respect, Clara. She sealed the letter and set it aside, feeling both relieved and anxious. The die was cast. There was no going back now. Mrs. Whitley arrived precisely at noon, driving a small wagon with the practiced ease of a woman who'd been handling horses since childhood. She was in her 60s, rail-thin and sharp-eyed, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her dress was practical homespun, and her hands were work-roughened. She looked like someone who'd seen every hardship the frontier could offer and had survived them all through sheer stubbornness. You must be Miss Wynne, she said, climbing down from the wagon without assistance. I'm Beatrice Whitley. Elias tells me you'll be staying on. Clara felt her cheeks flush. Yes, ma'am. I hope that doesn't cause you any concern. Mrs. Whitley fixed her with a long, assessing look. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. Child, I've lived in Wyoming territory for 40 years. I've seen every kind of arrangement people can make to survive out here. As long as you're here of your own free will, and Elias is treating you with respect, what concern is it of mine? Thank you, Clara said, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot. Over coffee and the cornbread Clara had baked that morning, Mrs. Whitley laid out her proposal. She'd come by Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays to help with the heavier work, laundry, deep cleaning, preserving food for winter. She'd stay most of the day, leaving before supper. Her presence would serve as chaperone enough to satisfy anyone with concerns about Clara's reputation. Though honestly, Mrs. Whitley said, spreading butter on a piece of cornbread, most folks out here are too busy surviving to worry much about scandal. We're not Boston. We're not even civilization, really. We're just people trying to make it through another winter. That's what I'm discovering, Clara said softly. Mrs. Whitley studied her over the rim of her coffee cup. Elias is a good man. Lost his whole family to fever 7 years back. Parents, 2 sisters, baby brother. Came out here to start fresh, to build something that was his. He's been alone too long, if you ask me. Needs someone to remind him there's more to life than work and duty. Clara felt her throat tighten. He told me he lost his family, but he didn't give details. He wouldn't. That's Elias. Keeps his grief close and his hopes closer. Mrs. Whitley set down her cup. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what kind of man you're dealing with. He's not going to push you for anything you're not ready to give. He's not going to make demands or expect payment for his kindness. But he's lonely, Miss Wynne. Bone-deep lonely. And if you're staying here just because you've got nowhere else to go, that's going to hurt him more than you realize. I'm not, Clara said quickly. I'm staying because I want to. Because this place, this life, it feels right in a way nothing else ever has. Mrs. Whitley nodded, satisfied. Good. Then we'll get along just fine. They spent the next hour discussing practical matters, the weekly schedule, the supplies needed for winter, the particulars of running a ranch household. Mrs. Whitley proved to be a wealth of information, and Clara found herself taking mental notes on everything from the best way to preserve vegetables to how to recognize the signs of an approaching blizzard. When Elias returned in mid-afternoon, he found them in the kitchen, laughing over Mrs. Whitley's story about her late husband's disastrous attempt to make soap. He stopped in the doorway, surprise flickering across his face at the easy camaraderie between the 2 women. Ladies, he said, removing his hat, I see you've been getting acquainted. Miss Wynne makes excellent cornbread, Mrs. Whitley announced, and she's got sense, which is more than I can say for most young women these days. I approve, Elias. Elias's ears turned slightly red. I'm glad to have your blessing, Beatrice. As you should be. Now, I'll be taking my leave. Got to get back before dark. She stood, smoothing her skirts. I'll see you Monday morning, Miss Wynne. Bring your work dress. We'll be doing laundry. After she left, Clara and Elias stood in the kitchen, the silence stretching between them. Finally, Elias spoke. Richards wasn't happy, but he accepted your decision. I gave him the letter for your aunt. Thank you. He said to tell you that if you change your mind, you can send word to the Turner Ranch. He'll be in the area for another week. Clara shook her head. I won't change my mind. Elias looked at her, really looked at her, and Clara saw something in his expression that made her heart beat faster. Not desire exactly, though there was an element of that, something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. The look of someone who'd found something they didn't know they'd been searching for. Good, he said softly. I'm glad. The days that followed developed a new rhythm. Mrs. Whitley came 3 times a week, her presence lending an air of respectability to the household. On those days, the ranch house buzzed with activity, washing and mending, preserving and cleaning, the comfortable work of women who understood the constant labor required to maintain a home on the frontier. On the other days, Clara and Elias fell into patterns of their own making. She'd rise early to make breakfast while he did the first round of chores. They'd eat together, discussing the day's plans. Then Elias would head out to work the land, mending fences, tending the horses, preparing for winter, while Clara managed the house. But as the days passed and her strength fully returned, Clara found herself venturing beyond the house more often. She'd bring Elias lunch in the fields, staying to talk while he ate. She'd help him brush down the horses in the evening, learning their names and personalities. She'd sit on the corral fence and watch him work with the new colt, marveling at the patience in his movements, the gentle firmness in his voice. One afternoon, 3 weeks after her decision to stay, Clara found Elias in the barn, struggling to lift a heavy saddle onto a high rack. Without thinking, she moved to help him, and together they hoisted it into place. When they stepped back, breathing hard from the effort. Their hands accidentally brushed. Both of them froze. The touch was electric, sending a jolt of awareness through Clara's entire body. She looked up and found Elias staring at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment she thought he might kiss her. For a moment she wanted him to. But Elias stepped back, putting careful distance between them. "Thank you for the help," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Of course," Clara managed, her own voice barely above a whisper. They stood there in the barn, dust motes dancing in the light filtering through the slats, the smell of hay and horses surrounding them. The moment stretched, heavy with possibility and restraint. "Clara," Elias began, then stopped. He removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd learned meant he was wrestling with something difficult. "I need to say something, and I need you to hear me out without interrupting. Can you do that?" Clara nodded, her heart pounding. "I know why you're here. I know you stayed because this place gives you peace, gives you purpose. And that's good. That's important. But I need you to know—" He paused, seeming to gather courage. "I need you to know that I've come to care for you. Not as a guest or someone I'm helping, as a woman. As someone I look forward to seeing every morning and think about every evening. Someone who's made this house feel like a home again." Clara opened her mouth to respond, but Elias held up a hand. "Let me finish. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm not expecting anything to change. You've been through hell, and the last thing you need is me complicating your life with my feelings. But I couldn't keep pretending that what I feel is simple hospitality or Christian charity. It's not. It's more. And I thought you should know." He settled his hat back on his head and turned toward the barn door. "Take all the time you need to think about that. And if it changes how you feel about staying here, I'll understand. I'll help you get to your aunt in Boston or anywhere else you want to go. No hard feelings, no obligations." Then he walked out, leaving Clara standing in the barn with her heart racing and her mind spinning. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the rapid beat beneath her palm. The truth was, she'd known, had felt the change in how Elias looked at her, in the careful way he maintained distance between them, in the tenderness beneath his practical care. But hearing him say it aloud, hearing the raw honesty in his voice changed everything. Because she felt it too. Had been feeling it for weeks, maybe since the moment he'd caught her before she hit the ground. The way her day felt incomplete until she saw him. The way her heart lifted when she heard his boots on the porch. The way she found excuses to be near him, to talk to him, to share space with him. She'd survived the wilderness and walked through tragedy, had lost everything, and somehow found herself here. With him. And the thought of leaving now felt like choosing to lose herself all over again. That evening, they ate dinner in charged silence. Elias didn't bring up his confession, and Clara couldn't find the words to address it. They cleaned up together, moving around each other with careful choreography, and then settled into their usual spots by the fire. Elias picked up the book they'd been reading, a collection of adventure stories, but he didn't open it right away. "Clara, I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable earlier. That wasn't my intention." "You didn't?" Clara said quickly. She took a breath, steadying herself. "Elias, look at me." He did, his gray eyes wary and hopeful all at once. "I need to tell you something too," Clara continued, "and I need you not to interrupt." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Fair enough." Clara twisted her hands in her lap, searching for the right words. "When I stumbled onto your ranch, I was a ghost. I was already dead in every way that mattered. I just hadn't stopped moving yet. You didn't just save my life, you gave me back my life. You gave me purpose and peace, and a place where I could remember who I was before tragedy tried to erase me." She paused, gathering courage. "But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about what you gave me and started being about who you are. The way you read to me in the evenings, the way you're patient with the horses, the way you never once made me feel small or helpless or like a burden, the way you see me, not as a victim or a charity case, but as a person, as Clara." Elias had gone very still, his eyes locked on her face. "So when you say you care for me as a woman, I want you to know that I care for you as a man, not as my rescuer or my host, but as Elias. The man who makes me laugh, who challenges me to think, Who makes this rough life feel like exactly where I'm supposed to be? The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Then Elias set down the book and crossed to her chair. He knelt beside it, taking her hand in both of his. Clara Wynne, I don't have much to offer you. This ranch is hard work and harder winters. The nearest town is 3 hours away. You'll go days without seeing anyone but me and Mrs. Whitley. There's no society here, no refinement, nothing like what you could have in Boston. I don't want Boston, Clara whispered. But what I can offer you is this: a home, a partnership. Someone who will never take you for granted or expect you to be anything other than exactly who you are. Someone who will stand beside you through whatever comes next. He paused, his voice dropping lower. Someone who will love you with everything he has for as long as he draws breath. Clara felt tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of joy, of relief, of coming home after being lost for so long. She slipped from the chair to kneel with him on the floor, their hands still clasped between them. Then that's what I want, she said. Not someday, not eventually. Now. I want this life with you, Elias Griffin. I want to build something here that's ours. I want to be your partner and your friend and... She hesitated, then pushed forward. And more than that, if you'll have me. Elias reached up with one hand and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks. Are you sure? Clara, I need you to be absolutely sure, because once you say yes, I'm never letting you go. I'm sure, Clara said, and she'd never been more certain of anything in her life. I'm completely sure. The kiss, when it came, was gentle and careful, a question asked and answered, a promise made without words. Clara felt something in her chest unlock, some last piece of armor she'd been wearing since the attack. She'd survived the wilderness, she'd walked through fire, and now, on the other side of all that pain, she'd found this. Not just safety, but belonging. Not just shelter, but home. When they finally pulled apart, Elias rested his forehead against hers. We should do this properly, he said. I should court you, take you to town dances, write you poetry. Clara laughed, the sound bright and genuine. I don't need poetry, Elias. I need this. I need you. I need the life we can build together. Then marry me, Elias said simply. Not someday. Soon. As soon as we can arrange it. I've waited long enough for something to live for. I don't want to wait any longer. Yes, Clara said without hesitation. Yes, I'll marry you. They stayed there on the floor beside the fire for a long time, holding each other in the flickering light, while outside the Wyoming wind sang its endless song across the prairie. Two people who had been broken by loss, now choosing to be made whole together. Two hearts that had survived the wilderness, now finding refuge in each other. The next morning, Elias rode to town to speak with the minister and file the necessary papers. Clara spent the day and a daze, moving through her chores in a fog of happiness. Mrs. Whitley arrived for her regular day of work and took one look at Clara's face before breaking into a knowing smile. He finally said something, did he? Clara felt herself blush. He asked me to marry him. I said yes. Mrs. Whitley let out a whoop of joy that startled the chickens in the yard. About time! I was beginning to think you two were going to dance around each other until spring. She pulled Clara into a fierce hug. I'm happy for you, child. Truly happy. Elias deserves some joy after all he's been through, and so do you. It's fast, Clara said, voicing the doubt that had been niggling at the back of her mind. People will talk. People always talk. That's what people do. Mrs. Whitley released her and returned to the washing. But anyone with eyes can see that you two fit. Sometimes the heart knows faster than the head. No point in waiting around just to satisfy gossips. The wedding was planned for 2 weeks hence, giving just enough time to arrange the ceremony and for Clara to make herself a proper dress. Mrs. Whitley helped, bringing fabric from town, a beautiful cream-colored wool that would serve as both wedding dress and Sunday best. Together, they cut and pinned and stitched, working by lamplight in the evenings while Elias read aloud or worked on his own preparations. He was building new furniture for the house, a larger wardrobe for their bedroom, a new dining table that would seat 6 instead of 4. For when we have guests, he said, and maybe, someday, for family. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Family. something they'd both lost and both longed for, something that could be built again from the ashes of grief. 5 days before the wedding, a letter arrived from Aunt Margaret. Clara opened it with trembling hands, expecting anger or disappointment. Instead, she found something unexpected. "My dear Clara, your letter arrived, and I confess I read it 3 times before I could properly absorb its contents. My first instinct was to write back with every argument I could muster for why you should reconsider. My second instinct was to book passage west and fetch you home myself. But then I remembered your father, my dear brother-in-law, and how he always said that you had steel in your spine beneath all that propriety, how you were stronger than anyone gave you credit for, including yourself. I dismissed it as a doting father's bias. Perhaps I was wrong. I will not pretend to understand your choice, Clara. Boston could offer you security and society, but you have chosen purpose over comfort, and I suppose there is courage in that. Your mother would have worried herself sick, but I think your father would have understood. I am enclosing a small gift, my own mother's locket, which I had been saving for you. Wear it on your wedding day and know that you are not as alone in this world as you might feel. You have family who love you, even if we do not comprehend all your choices. Write to me when you can. Let me know you are well and happy. That is all an old woman can ask. With love, Aunt Margaret." Inside the envelope was a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. Clara opened it to find miniature portraits, one of her mother as a young woman, one of a man Clara didn't recognize but who must have been her grandfather. She held it to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "Good news?" Elias asked gently, seeing her tears. "The best news," Clara said. "I haven't lost everything after all. Some things remain." The wedding day arrived with clear skies and crisp autumn air. Mrs. Whitley came early to help Clara dress, arranging her hair in an elegant twist and pinning wildflowers, the last of the season, throughout the golden strands. The cream wool dress fit perfectly, and with Aunt Margaret's locket around her neck, Clara looked like a bride from the pages of a storybook. The ceremony was simple, held in the small church in Fort Bridger with perhaps 20 people in attendance. Jim Turner and his wife were there, along with several other ranchers from the area and their families. Mrs. Whitley stood as Clara's witness, and Jim Turner stood as Elias's. The minister, a gentle old man who'd been performing marriages in Wyoming Territory for 30 years, spoke of partnership and perseverance, of building lives together in hard country. When Elias saw Clara walking down the aisle, his expression transformed. The careful reserve he usually maintained cracked, revealing raw emotion beneath. Love, wonder, gratitude, all of it written plainly on his face for anyone to see. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to honor and cherish, to stand together through whatever hardships came. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Elias kissed Clara with a tenderness that made Mrs. Whitley dab at her eyes with her handkerchief. The celebration afterward was modest: cake and coffee in the church hall, congratulations from neighbors, practical advice from the ranch wives about surviving the approaching winter. But through it all, Clara felt wrapped in warmth. These people, rough-edged frontier folks who'd come out in their Sunday best to witness 2 broken people choosing to be whole together, they were her community now, her people. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Elias helped Clara into their wagon for the ride home. Mrs. Whitley had discreetly prepared the house, leaving a wedding supper warming by the stove and extra firewood stacked by the hearth. As they pulled away from the church, Clara looked back at the small gathering waving them off, then forward to the vast prairie stretching before them. "Are you happy?" Elias asked quietly, his hand finding hers on the wagon seat. Clara leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the reality of this new life they were beginning. "I'm happy," she said. "I'm finally, truly happy." The ranch house appeared on the horizon as the last light painted everything gold and red. Home. Not the place she'd grown up, not the destination her family had been seeking, but home nonetheless, chosen rather than inherited, built on mutual respect and growing love rather than duty and expectation. That night, as they sat together by the fire, Elias took Clara's hand and looked at her with such profound tenderness that it made her heart ache. "I want you to know something," he said. "You walked into my life half dead and completely lost. But you gave me something I didn't know I'd been missing. You gave me hope, Clara. Hope that life could be more than just surviving day to day, that it could be rich and full and worth living. Clara squeezed his hand. You gave me the same thing. You caught me when I fell, and you've been catching me every day since. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low. Two people who had found each other against impossible odds. Outside, the Wyoming night stretched vast and dark, full of challenges yet to come. Brutal winters and harsh summers, loneliness and hardship, and all the trials that frontier life promised. But inside, wrapped in warmth and firelight, and the beginning of forever, Clara and Elias had everything they needed. They had each other. They had purpose. They had home. And that, Clara thought as she drifted towards sleep that night in her husband's arms, was more than enough. It was everything. The first weeks of marriage passed in a haze of discovery and adjustment. Clara learned the rhythm of Elias's days, the particular way he liked his coffee in the morning, the small tells that indicated whether he was troubled or content. He learned her habits too, how she hummed while cooking, how she always checked the horizon at dusk as if looking for something she couldn't name, how she slept curled on her side with one hand tucked under her cheek like a child. They learned each other's bodies with a tenderness that surprised them both. Elias had expected to find a widow's grief or a survivor's trauma. Instead, he found a woman who met him with equal parts curiosity and desire, who laughed when they fumbled in the darkness, who held nothing back once she'd decided to trust him completely. Clara had expected awkwardness or pain. Instead, she found safety and pleasure in equal measure, discovered that intimacy could be both gentle and intense, that her body could feel something other than exhaustion and fear. But winter was coming, and the ranch demanded attention that couldn't be postponed for the luxury of extended honeymoon bliss. The cattle needed to be moved to winter pasture. The barn needed reinforcing against the storms that would soon howl down from the mountains. Food had to be preserved, wood had to be chopped and stacked. Every crack in the house had to be chinked against the cold that would try to creep through and kill them in their sleep. Clara threw herself into the work with determination that both impressed and worried Elias. She worked alongside Mrs. Whitley to preserve everything the garden had produced, tomatoes and beans, squash and carrots, putting up jar after jar that would feed them through the long months when nothing grew. She helped Elias repair the chicken coop, learning to hammer nails with accuracy, if not grace. She even insisted on learning to shoot, standing in the yard with Elias's rifle until her shoulder ached from the recoil, and she could consistently hit the target he'd set up. "Why do you need to learn this?" Elias asked one afternoon, watching her reload with practiced efficiency. Clara lowered the rifle and met his eyes. "Because I won't be helpless again. If something happens, if you're hurt or sick or away when trouble comes, I need to be able to protect myself, protect us." Elias understood. The attack that had killed her family had left scars deeper than the physical wounds. She needed to know she could fight back, could defend what was hers. So he taught her everything he knew: how to shoot, how to track weather patterns, how to read the behavior of animals that might signal danger. He taught her without pity or condescension, treating her as a partner who needed skills rather than a fragile thing to be protected. 6 weeks into their marriage, the first real storm arrived. Clara woke to absolute silence, the eerie quiet that came when heavy snow muffled every sound. She rose and padded to the window, pulling back the curtain to reveal a world transformed. Snow had fallen through the night, 3 feet at least, turning the familiar landscape into something alien and beautiful and terrifying. The barn was barely visible, and the mountains beyond had disappeared entirely into white. Elias came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Welcome to Wyoming winter," he murmured against her hair. "This is just the first. We'll see a dozen more before spring." "It's beautiful," Clara whispered, "and frightening. It's both. That's the way of things out here." He released her and moved to stoke the fire. "We'll need to dig out to the barn. Check on the animals. Make sure nothing collapsed under the weight of the snow." They worked together through the morning, bundling against the cold and breaking trail through drifts that came up to Clara's thighs. The horses were restless but unharmed. The cattle in the near pasture had huddled together for warmth and survived the night. Everything was as secure as they'd worked to make it. But that afternoon, as Clara prepared lunch, she heard Elias cursing in the barn. She grabbed her coat and hurried out to find him staring at the far wall, where a section of the roof had partially collapsed, snow and broken timber creating a dangerous mess. "Damn it," Elias said, running a hand through his hair. "I thought we'd reinforced this section enough. The weight must have been more than it could bear." "Can we fix it?" Clara asked, already eyeing the damage and trying to calculate what would be needed. "We'll have to. Can't leave it like this. The whole roof could come down." Elias looked at the snow still falling outside. "But not in this weather. We'll have to wait for it to clear, then work fast before the next storm." The storm lasted 3 days. They were trapped inside, the world beyond their windows an impenetrable wall of white. Clara had been prepared for the boredom, for the sense of confinement. What she hadn't been prepared for was the intimacy of it. 3 days with no obligations beyond keeping the fire going and themselves fed. 3 days of talking about everything and nothing, of reading aloud until their voices grew hoarse, of making love in the afternoon because there was nothing else to do and every reason to remind themselves they were alive. On the 4th day, the sun returned, blinding and glorious against the snow. Elias and Clara worked together to repair the barn roof, their breath-forming clouds in the frigid air. Jim Turner and his 2 grown sons appeared midday, having dug themselves out and come to check on their neighbors. With 4 men working, the repair went quickly, and by nightfall the barn was secure once more. Martha Turner, Jim's wife, had come along and helped Clara prepare a meal substantial enough to feed the workers. As they all sat around the table, eating stew and fresh bread, Clara felt something shift in her understanding of frontier life. This wasn't just about individual survival. It was about community, about neighbors helping neighbors, because someday you'd be the one needing help. "You did good work today, Clara," Jim said, nodding at her across the table. "Not many women would be up on a roof in this weather." "I'm learning that out here. You do what needs doing," Clara replied. "Gender doesn't much matter when a roof needs fixing." Martha laughed, a warm sound that filled the room. "You'll fit in fine here, girl. We need more women with backbone and fewer delicate flowers." After the Turners left, Clara and Elias cleaned up in comfortable silence. When they finally settled by the fire, Clara felt bone-tired but satisfied. She'd worked hard, contributed meaningfully, proven to herself and others that she belonged here. "You impressed Jim today," Elias said quietly, "and that's not easy to do. He's seen plenty of folks give up and head back east after one hard winter." "I'm not going anywhere," Clara said firmly. "This is my home now. Our home. I'll fight for it." Elias pulled her close, and they sat watching the fire dance, 2 people who'd chosen the hard path and found it worth every challenge. But the challenges kept coming. 2 weeks later, Mrs. Whitley arrived with troubling news. There'd been an outbreak of scarlet fever in town. 3 children had died and more were sick. The doctor had quarantined several families, and the church had been turned into a makeshift hospital. "I won't be able to come out for a while," Mrs. Whitley said, her face drawn with worry. "My daughter's youngest is sick. Not badly yet, thank God, but I need to be there." "Of course," Clara said immediately. "Family comes first. Is there anything we can do to help?" "Stay healthy," Mrs. Whitley said bluntly. "Last thing the town needs is more sick folks. And pray. Pray hard." For 3 weeks, they had no news from town. Elias wanted to ride in to check on things, but Clara begged him not to risk exposure. They were isolated on the ranch, safe from the sickness that was ravaging the community. Every day that passed without word was agonizing, but every day they remained healthy was a blessing. When Mrs. Whitley finally returned, she looked 10 years older. The fever had taken 2 more children before running its course. Her grandson had survived, but barely. The whole town was exhausted, grieving, traumatized. "I'm so sorry," Clara said, embracing the older woman. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that." Mrs. Whitley clung to her for a moment, then pulled back and wiped her eyes. "We survived. That's what matters. We always survive." She looked around the ranch house, at the normalcy of it. "It's good to be back. Good to be somewhere that death hasn't touched." But death had touched them all, Clara thought. Mrs. Whitley had lost neighbors. Clara had lost her family. Elias had lost everyone he'd loved before starting over in Wyoming. Maybe that's what made them strong. Not the absence of grief, but the determination to keep living despite it. As winter deepened, Clara discovered she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but hadn't said anything. wanting to be certain before raising Elias's hopes. When she finally told him, over dinner on a frigid January evening, his face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, fear, wonder, before settling on something that looked like awe. "A baby," he said softly. "We're going to have a baby." "Next summer," Clara confirmed, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "July or August, the doctor thinks." Elias came around the table and knelt beside her chair, placing his hand over hers. "Are you happy? Is this what you want?" Clara thought about the question seriously before answering. A baby, a new life, a new responsibility, a new person to love and potentially lose. The thought terrified her, but it also filled her with fierce joy. "Yes," she said firmly. "This is what I want. A family. Our family." That night, as they lay in bed, Elias traced patterns on Clara's stomach and talked about the future. They'd need to build an addition to the house, create a proper nursery. They'd need more supplies from town. They'd need to prepare for the reality that Clara would be vulnerable for months, that the birth itself would be dangerous in a place so far from medical help. "I'm scared," Clara admitted in the darkness. "Women die in childbirth, especially out here, where help is so far away." "I know," Elias said quietly. "I'm scared too. But we'll do everything we can to keep you safe. We'll get Mrs. Whitley here early. We'll have the doctor standing by in town. We'll prepare for every possibility. And if something goes wrong," Elias pulled her closer, "then we'll face it together, like we face everything else." The pregnancy changed things in ways both subtle and profound. Elias became even more protective, insisting that Clara avoid heavy lifting or anything that might be dangerous. Clara chafed against the restrictions, but understood they came from love rather than condescension. She compromised by taking on more of the lighter tasks: cooking, mending, keeping accounts, while Elias handled the physical labor. Mrs. Whitley was overjoyed at the news and immediately began knitting tiny garments and collecting baby supplies. Martha Turner sent over a cradle her own children had used, beautifully made and well worn. Other ranch wives Clara had met only once or twice sent gifts and advice, welcoming her into the community of frontier mothers. But as Clara's body changed and her belly swelled, she found herself thinking about her own mother more often. Thinking about the stories she'd told of Clara's birth, the songs she'd sung, the wisdom she'd shared about motherhood. Clara missed her with an ache that felt physical, wished desperately that she could ask just one more question, hear one more piece of advice. One evening in early March, as they sat by the fire, Clara voiced her fears to Elias. "What if I'm not a good mother? What if I don't know what to do?" Elias looked up from the harness he was mending. "You'll learn. You'll make mistakes, and you'll figure it out. That's what every parent does." "But I don't have my mother to ask. I don't have anyone who knew me as a child, who can tell me what I was like, who can help me understand." Clara's voice broke. Elias set aside his work and came to sit beside her. "You're right, and that's a loss that nothing can replace. But you have Mrs. Whitley, who's raised 5 children. You have Martha Turner and the other ranch wives, who've all survived what you're about to face. You have me, and we'll figure this out together. And you have your mother's strength, Clara. I see it in you every day." Clara leaned against his shoulder, letting the tears come. Grief was like that. It waited in ambush, striking when you least expected it. But Elias was there to catch her, as he'd been catching her since the day they met. Spring arrived slowly, grudgingly, the snow retreating inch by stubborn inch. As the world turned green again, Clara's belly grew round and prominent. She moved with the careful deliberation of a woman carrying precious cargo, one hand always resting protectively on her stomach. The baby kicked and tumbled inside her, making its presence known at all hours. Clara would lie awake at night, feeling the movements, marveling at the life she was creating. Elias built the nursery addition with help from Jim Turner and his sons, working long hours to have it finished before the baby arrived. It was a small room off the main bedroom, with a window facing east to catch the morning light. He made the furniture himself: a cradle, a changing table, a rocking chair where Clara could nurse. When it was finished, Clara stood in the doorway and cried at the beauty of it, at the love evident in every carefully sanded edge and precisely fitted joint. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Our baby is so lucky to have you as a father." Elias wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands resting on her swollen belly. "I'm the lucky one," he said. "Both of you, you're everything I never knew I needed." As Clara's due date approached, Mrs. Whitley moved into the ranch house, taking over the spare bedroom so she'd be on hand when labor started. The doctor in Fort Bridger had agreed to come out when sent for, though they all knew that babies arrived on their own schedule and that help might not arrive in time. The waiting was the hardest part. Clara felt huge and uncomfortable, her back aching constantly, sleep elusive. She was ready to not be pregnant anymore, ready to meet this person who'd been sharing her body for months. But she was also terrified of what came next: the pain of labor, the dangers of childbirth, the responsibility of keeping a tiny human alive. Labor began on a sweltering July afternoon. Clara was in the garden, picking vegetables for dinner, when the first contraction hit, a tightening across her belly that stole her breath. She stood still, waiting for it to pass, then hurried inside to tell Mrs. Whitley. "How far apart are the pains?" Mrs. Whitley asked calmly, immediately shifting into midwife mode. "That was just the first one." "Then we've got time. First babies take a while. Go rest while you can. I'll get everything ready and send Elias to fetch the doctor." But Elias refused to leave. "Jim's oldest boy can ride to town. I'm staying here." The labor progressed slowly through the afternoon and into the evening. Clara paced the house, pausing when contractions gripped her, breathing through the pain as Mrs. Whitley coached. Elias stayed close, offering his hand to squeeze, his presence a steadying force. As night fell and the contractions grew stronger and closer together, Clara began to understand why women screamed during childbirth. The pain was unlike anything she'd experienced, all-consuming, relentless, impossible to escape. "I can't do this," she gasped during a particularly brutal contraction. I can't. "You can," Elias said firmly, wiping her face with a cool cloth. "You're the strongest person I know, Clara. You walked through the wilderness alone. You survived losing everything. You can do this." "You walked through worse," Mrs. Whitley added. "This pain has a purpose. It's bringing your baby into the world. You can do this, child." The doctor arrived near midnight, examining Clara quickly and nodding approval. "You're doing fine, Mrs. Griffin. Not much longer now." But not much longer turned into 3 more hours of agony. Clara lost track of time, lost track of everything except the pain and the desperate need to push, to get this baby out, to end the ordeal. She squeezed Elias's hand so hard she was sure she was breaking bones, but he never flinched, never left her side, his voice a constant stream of encouragement and love. Finally, as dawn light began to creep through the windows, the baby arrived, a red-faced, squalling, perfect little girl. The doctor placed her on Clara's chest, and Clara felt her heart crack open with love so fierce it hurt worse than the labor. "A daughter," Elias breathed, his voice choked with emotion. "We have a daughter." The baby, they named her Sarah, after Elias's mother, was tiny and perfect, with Clara's honey-colored hair and Elias's gray eyes. She nursed with immediate competence, her small hands curling into fists as she fed. Clara couldn't stop looking at her, couldn't stop marveling that this perfect creature had come from her body. "She's going to be strong like her mother," Mrs. Whitley pronounced, cleaning up with efficient movements. "Look at those lungs. That's a baby who knows how to make herself heard." "Just like Clara," Elias said, grinning through his exhaustion, a survivor from the very start. The first weeks with Sarah were simultaneously the most exhausting and most joyful of Clara's life. The baby needed constant care, feeding every 2 hours, changing, soothing, holding. Clara was constantly tired, her body still recovering from the trauma of childbirth while being called upon to produce milk and function on virtually no sleep. But every time she looked at Sarah's face, every time the baby curled her tiny fingers around Clara's thumb, every time Elias sang to his daughter in his deep, gentle voice, Clara felt a happiness so profound it bordered on pain. This was what she'd survived for. This was why she'd kept walking through the wilderness, so she could arrive here, in this moment, with this family she'd built from the ashes of the old one. Mrs. Whitley stayed for 2 weeks, teaching Clara the basics of infant care and giving her precious time to recover. When she finally returned to her own home, Clara felt a moment of panic. Could she really do this alone? But Elias was there, taking his turn walking the floor with Sarah when she cried at night, changing diapers with the same careful competence he brought to everything, falling completely in love with his daughter in a way that made Clara's heart swell. As summer deepened and Sarah grew, Clara found herself settling into the rhythms of motherhood. The constant exhaustion began to feel normal. The anxiety that something terrible would happen to Sarah began to ease slightly, though Clara knew it would never completely disappear. She'd learned too well how quickly everything could be taken away, but she'd also learned that life continued anyway. That joy could be found in the smallest moments. Sarah's first smile, the sound of Elias's laughter when the baby grabbed his beard, the way the three of them fit together like pieces of a puzzle Clara hadn't known was incomplete. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, Sarah sleeping peacefully in Clara's arms, Elias spoke quietly. Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if you'd gone to Boston? If you'd said yes to your aunt's offer? Clara thought about it seriously before answering. Sometimes, I think about the comfort, the security, the society parties and the fine dresses and all the things that seemed so important once. Do you regret staying? Clara looked down at Sarah's sleeping face, then over at Elias's weathered hands and worried eyes. Not for a single moment. That life would have been easy, but it wouldn't have been mine. This life, with you, with her, with this land, this is real. This is where I belong. Elias reached over and took her free hand, threading his fingers through hers. I love you, Clara Griffin, more than I thought it was possible to love another person. I love you too, Clara said softly. You caught me when I fell, and you've been catching me every day since. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned gold and red and purple as the first stars appeared in the vast Wyoming night. Sarah stirred and made small sounds in her sleep. The horses nickered in the barn. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, the sounds of home, of life continuing in its endless cycle. Clara thought about the girl she'd been a year ago, broken, lost, stumbling through the wilderness with nothing left to lose. She thought about the moment Elias had caught her, those strong arms saving her from falling. She thought about all the choices that had led her here, all the pain that had transformed into something like wisdom, all the loss that had somehow made room for new love. What are you thinking? Elias asked, seeing the expression on her face. Claire smiled, holding their daughter close and her husband's hand tight. I'm thinking that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you leads to the best thing. I'm thinking that I wouldn't change anything, even the terrible parts, because they brought me here. To you, to Sarah, to this life we've built. That's a long thought, Elias said, but his voice was warm with understanding. It's a grateful thought, Clara corrected. I'm grateful, Elias, for everything, even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts, maybe, because they taught me what strength really is. As full darkness settled over the prairie and the stars multiplied overhead, they went inside together, carrying their sleeping daughter, ready to face whatever the Wyoming night might bring. They had survived the wilderness separately and found each other in the aftermath. They had built a home from nothing, created a family from loss, transformed tragedy into hope. And tomorrow, they would wake and do it all again, not because it was easy, but because it was theirs, their life, their choice, their love. Hard-won and precious beyond measure. Everything they'd fought for, everything they'd survived to find. A family forged in fire and tempered by the unforgiving frontier, stronger for all the tests they'd endured. This was home. This was love. This was everything. Sarah was 6 months old when the first real test of their family came. It started with a letter from the territorial governor's office, delivered by a rider who looked exhausted from his journey. Elias read it twice, his face growing darker with each pass before handing it wordlessly to Clara. The railroad was coming through, not close enough to make their lives easier, but close enough to matter. The proposed route cut through what had traditionally been open range land used by several ranches in the area, including a significant portion of what Elias considered his grazing territory. The letter was a formal notice that surveyors would be coming through in the spring to mark the final route, and that all ranchers should prepare to renegotiate their land claims. What does this mean? Clara asked, though she already knew the answer wouldn't be good. It means everything's about to change, Elias said heavily. He moved to the window, staring out at the land he'd worked so hard to claim and improve. The railroad brings civilization, and civilization brings people. Lots of people. Towns will spring up along the route. More settlers will come. The open range will get carved up and fenced off. The way we've been living, it won't last much longer. Clara shifted Sarah to her other hip. The baby had been fussy all morning, fighting sleep and wanting to be held constantly. Is that necessarily bad? More people means more markets for beef, more customers. Maybe, or maybe it means more competition, more regulations, more interference from people who've never set foot on a ranch telling us how to run our operations. Elias rubbed his face tiredly. I knew this was coming eventually. The territory can't stay wild forever, but I thought we'd have more time. That evening, Jim Turner rode over with the same news. He and Elias sat at the kitchen table, spreading out crude maps and discussing strategies while Clara listened and nursed Sarah. The conversation lasted until well past midnight, growing more heated as the whiskey bottle emptied. We need to organize, Jim insisted. All the ranchers in the area, present a united front to the railroad and the territorial government. Make sure they understand that we were here first, that we have rights. Rights mean nothing if you can't enforce them, Elias countered. The railroad has money and political influence. What do we have? Cattle and stubbornness. Then we get our own influence. We form a cattlemen's association, pool our resources, hire a lawyer who understands territorial law. Jim leaned forward intently. Elias, if we don't fight for this, we'll lose everything. The railroad will take what it wants and leave us with scraps. Clara spoke up from her chair by the fire. What about compromise? What if we work with the railroad instead of fighting them? Find a route that works for everyone? Both men turned to look at her. Jim's expression was skeptical, but Elias looked thoughtful. Explain, he said. Clara adjusted Sarah, who had fallen asleep at her breast. The railroad wants the most direct route to minimize construction costs. But there might be alternatives that are only slightly longer but avoid cutting through the best grazing land. If we survey the territory ourselves and present them with options, show them we're willing to work with them, rather than just oppose them, we might have more influence over the final decision. Jim snorted. You really think railroad men will listen to ranchers? No, Clara said calmly, but they might listen to money. If we can show them that a slightly different route means keeping the ranchers in the area prosperous enough to ship cattle on their railroad, to buy supplies from their company stores, to be customers rather than enemies, that might matter to them. The two men exchanged glances. Then Jim slowly nodded. That's not a bad idea, actually. Smart thinking, Clara. My wife's full of smart thinking, Elias said, pride evident in his voice. It's why I married her. Over the next weeks, Elias threw himself into organizing the ranchers. Meetings were held at various properties, drawing men from ranches scattered across hundreds of square miles. Clara attended many of these gatherings, Sarah strapped to her back in a carrier Elias had fashioned from leather and canvas. She listened more than she spoke, learning the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined the ranching community. Some of the men resented her presence, believing that ranch business was men's business. But others, especially those whose wives Clara had befriended, appreciated her practical insights and her ability to see angles the men missed. Slowly, grudgingly, she earned a place at the table. The Wyoming Cattlemen's Association was formally established in October, with Elias voted in as secretary and Jim Turner as president. They pooled funds to hire a lawyer from Cheyenne, a sharp-eyed man named Blackwood who understood both territorial law and railroad politics. By December, they'd completed their own survey of the territory and had drawn up 3 alternative routes for the railroad, each one carefully calculated to minimize disruption to existing ranching operations. But winter arrived before they could present their proposal, and travel became impossible. They were forced to wait, anxiety building with each snowfall, wondering what decisions were being made in distant offices while they sat isolated on their ranches. That winter was harder than the previous one. Sarah was teething, which meant long nights of crying and short tempers all around. The cattle suffered losses from the brutal cold despite Elias's best efforts. and the uncertainty about the railroad hung over everything like a dark cloud, turning every conversation eventually toward the same anxious questions. Clara found herself stretched thin between caring for Sarah, managing the household, and supporting Elias through his worry. Some days she felt like she was barely holding everything together, moving from crisis to crisis without ever getting ahead. The romance and adventure of frontier life had worn down to the hard reality of endless work and constant stress. One particularly difficult night in February, when Sarah had been crying for hours and wouldn't be comforted, Clara finally broke down. She handed the screaming baby to Elias and walked outside into the freezing night, standing on the porch in just her nightgown, letting the cold shock her system. Elias found her there 5 minutes later, having somehow gotten Sarah to sleep. He wrapped a blanket around Clara's shoulders and held her while she cried. "I can't do this," she sobbed. "I'm not strong enough. I thought I was, but I'm not. It's too hard, all of it, and I don't know how to keep going." "You keep going the same way you've always kept going," Elias said gently. "One step at a time, one day at a time. You don't have to be strong enough for everything. You just have to be strong enough for right now." "And what if I'm not? What if I fail? What if I'm not the woman you thought I was?" Elias turned her to face him, his hands firm on her shoulders. "Clara Griffin, you are exactly the woman I thought you were. You're tired. You're overwhelmed. You're human. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you real." Clara leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I miss my mother," she whispered. "I miss having someone to ask for advice. Someone who's been through this and can tell me it gets easier." "It does get easier," said a voice from the darkness. Mrs. Whitley emerged from the shadows, wrapped in her heavy coat. "Sorry to intrude, but I saw the light and thought I'd check on you all. The baby keeping you up?" "Among other things," Clara said, wiping her eyes. Mrs. Whitley climbed the porch steps and studied Clara with knowing eyes. "You're worn out, bone-tired in a way that sleep won't fix. I've been there. Every mother has. And you're right. It's hard not having your own mother to lean on. But you've got me, child, and Martha Turner, and half a dozen other ranch wives who've survived exactly what you're going through now." "I feel like I should be handling this better," Clara admitted. "Like I'm failing somehow." "Failing at what? Being superhuman?" Mrs. Whitley snorted. "Nobody handles a teething baby in Wyoming winter and railroad politics all at once without losing their mind a little. The fact that you're still standing means you're doing better than most." The three of them stood together on the porch, breath-forming clouds in the frigid air. Finally, Mrs. Whitley spoke again. "Here's what we're going to do. Tomorrow, I'm coming over and I'm taking that baby for the entire day. You two are going to sleep, really sleep, not just doze while listening for crying. And then you're going to remember why you chose each other in the first place. Understand?" "Mrs. Whitley, you don't have to," Clara started. "I know I don't have to. I want to. That's what family does. And we're family now, aren't we?" Clara felt tears threaten again, but these were different tears. "Yes, we're family." True to her word, Mrs. Whitley arrived at dawn the next morning and shooed Clara and Elias back to bed. Clara fell asleep almost instantly, too exhausted to argue. She woke 12 hours later to afternoon light and the smell of something delicious cooking. Elias stirred beside her, reaching for her instinctively. "We slept," he said wonderingly. "Actually slept." They found Mrs. Whitley in the kitchen with Sarah, who was playing happily with wooden spoons and making delighted noises. The house had been cleaned, bread had been baked, and a pot of stew was simmering on the stove. "Feeling human again?" Mrs. Whitley asked with a knowing smile. "More human than I have in weeks," Clara admitted. She picked up Sarah, who squealed with joy and grabbed at Clara's hair. "Thank you, truly." "Don't thank me. Just remember this feeling when you need to ask for help again. Nobody survives out here alone. We survive together or not at all." Spring arrived late that year, but when it finally came, it came with a rush. The snow melted, turning every creek into a torrent and every path into mud. The railroad surveyors appeared in early April, a team of 6 men with instruments and maps, marking stakes and taking measurements. Elias and Jim Turner met with them multiple times, presenting the Cattlemen's Association's alternative routes. The chief surveyor, a pragmatic man named Anderson, listened politely but committed to nothing. He had his orders from the railroad company, and those orders didn't include consulting with local ranchers. The tension in the community ratcheted up. Some ranchers wanted to physically prevent the surveyors from working. Others argued for legal challenges. The association meetings grew heated, with men shouting at each other and old grievances surfacing. Clara watched it all with growing concern, recognizing the pattern. When men felt powerless, they often turned that feeling outward, looking for someone to blame or fight. She pulled Elias aside after one particularly contentious meeting. "This is getting dangerous. Men are talking about sabotage, about running the surveyors off with guns. Someone's going to get hurt." "I know," Elias said grimly. "I'm trying to keep things calm, but some of these men have been out here for decades. They see the railroad as an invasion, and they want to fight back. Then we need to give them something else to fight for instead of something to fight against." Clara had been thinking about this for days, turning the problem over in her mind. What if we propose something that would benefit everyone? Not just avoiding the worst route, but actually improving things? Like what? A depot, a shipping station, something that would make the ranchers' lives easier while also serving the railroad's interests. Clara spoke quickly, ideas flowing. If we can convince the railroad to put a depot somewhere that works for the ranches, it would reduce driving distances and shipping costs. That benefits us. But it also means more business for the railroad, more cattle shipped, more revenue. That benefits them. Elias stared at her. "Claire Griffin, you're a genius." "I'm practical," Clara corrected. "There's a difference." They presented the depot proposal at the next association meeting. The response was mixed. Some ranchers saw the wisdom in it, others viewed it as capitulation to the railroad. But crucially, enough people supported it to give Blackwood, their lawyer, something to negotiate with. The railroad representatives came to Fort Bridger in May for formal negotiations. The entire association turned out, packing the hotel meeting room beyond capacity. Clara sat in the back with Sarah on her lap, listening as Blackwood presented their case with lawyerly precision. The alternative routes, the depot proposal, the economic arguments for cooperation rather than conflict. The lead railroad representative, a Boston man named Harrigan with slicked back hair and expensive clothes, listened with barely concealed impatience. When Blackwood finished, Harrigan stood and addressed the room with the condescending tone of someone speaking to ignorant children. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your concerns, but the railroad cannot alter its planned route based on local preferences. We have engineering requirements, cost considerations, and timeline pressures that supersede individual property interests. The route has been decided. Construction will begin this summer. I suggest you all adjust your operations accordingly." The room erupted. Men shouted, some surging toward the front. Jim Turner had to physically restrain one rancher who looked ready to punch Harrigan. Clara sat very still, watching the railroad man's face, reading his body language. He was scared beneath the arrogance. Scared of this room full of rough frontiersmen, scared that his carefully planned presentation had fallen apart. She stood, handling Sarah to Mrs. Whitley, and made her way to the front of the room. The men were too busy shouting to notice her at first. Then Elias saw her and called for quiet. Gradually, the noise died down. "Mr. Harrigan," Clara said clearly, "may I ask you a question?" Harrigan looked surprised to be addressed by a woman, but nodded. "Of course, ma'am." "Have you ever spent a winter in Wyoming?" No, ma'am. I have not." "Have you ever driven cattle, mended fence, fought off wolves, delivered a calf in a blizzard?" Clara's voice was calm but carried through the room. "Because everyone in this room has done all those things. We're not asking you to understand our lives, Mr. Harrigan. We're asking you to respect them enough to listen." Harrigan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Clara continued, "You say the route has been decided, but decisions can be reconsidered if new information warrants it. We're offering you that information. We're offering you a partnership that could make your railroad more profitable while preserving livelihoods that took decades to build. That's not ignorant locals complaining about progress. That's good business sense." She walked closer to where Harrigan stood, and he involuntarily took a step back. "You're going to build your railroad. We understand that. We're not trying to stop progress. We're trying to shape it so that everyone benefits. You can reject our proposals and make enemies of every rancher in this territory. Or you can work with us and have allies who'll use your railroad, support your business, and help you succeed. Which makes more sense to you as a businessman? The room was completely silent. Every eye was on Harrigan, waiting for his response. The railroad man looked around at the sea of weathered faces, at the men who'd been ready to fight minutes ago, now waiting to see if reason would prevail. I'll need to consult with my superiors, he said finally, but I'll recommend they review your alternative proposals. That's the best I can offer. That's all we're asking, Clara said. A fair hearing, a chance to be heard. The negotiations stretched over 3 days. In the end, the railroad agreed to a modified route that avoided the best grazing land and committed to building a depot at a location that served the ranching community. It wasn't everything the association wanted, but it was enough. Enough to preserve their livelihoods, enough to maintain peace, enough to prove that cooperation was possible even on the fractious frontier. As they rode home from Fort Bridger, Sarah sleeping in Clara's arms, Elias was quiet. Finally he spoke. You saved us back there. If you hadn't stepped in, those men would have started a war they couldn't win. I just said what needed saying. No, Elias said firmly. You did more than that. You reminded everyone that there's strength in reason, not just in anger, that we could be smart about this instead of just stubborn. Clara looked out at the prairie rolling by, at the familiar landmarks that meant home was near. I learned something when I lost my family. Being right doesn't matter if you end up dead. Sometimes you have to bend instead of break. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is compromise. Is that what we've been doing? Elias asked. Compromising? We've been surviving, Clara corrected, which means being flexible enough to adapt when we have to. The railroad's coming whether we like it or not. At least now we've ensured it comes in a way we can live with. That summer, as construction crews began working on the railroad in the distance, life on the ranch continued. Sarah learned to crawl, then to pull herself up on furniture, constantly on the verge of those first independent steps. Clara planted a larger garden, putting in vegetables and herbs and even a few flowers. Elias expanded the herd, buying breeding stock from other ranches and improving his bloodlines. The depot was completed in August, a simple wooden structure but solid and functional. The first cattle shipment went out in September, and the ease of it, being able to drive the herd just a few miles instead of the days-long drives to distant markets, proved the value of everything they'd fought for. Other changes came too. A town began forming around the depot, just a few buildings at first but growing. A general store, a blacksmith, a small hotel. New settlers arrived on every train, families looking to stake claims and build lives. The wild, open territory that Clara had stumbled into nearly 2 years ago was transforming into something more settled, more civilized. Mrs. Whitley observed these changes with mixed feelings. I remember when this was all empty land, she said one afternoon, helping Clara preserve tomatoes. When you could ride for days without seeing another soul, part of me misses that. But part of you doesn't? Clara guessed. Part of me is grateful my grandchildren will grow up with schools nearby and doctors and all the things we had to do without. Progress costs something, but it gives something too. Mrs. Whitley sealed another jar with practiced efficiency. The trick is remembering what matters and holding on to that while letting go of the rest. Clara thought about that as she worked. What mattered? Her family, certainly. The land, the home they'd built, the community they'd become part of. Those things were worth fighting for, worth adapting for, worth whatever compromises were necessary to preserve them. That evening, as she and Elias sat on the porch watching Sarah toddle unsteadily across the yard, Clara voiced what she'd been thinking about all day. Do you ever regret it? Taking me in? Everything that came after? Elias looked at her in surprise. Where's this coming from? I just wonder sometimes if your life would be simpler if you'd sent me on to Boston like my aunt wanted. If you'd stayed alone here without all the complications I brought with me. Elias set down the fence post he'd been whittling and turned to face her fully. Clara, before you arrived, I was existing, not living, going through the motions because that's what you do. You keep moving, you keep working, you don't think too hard about whether any of it means anything. Then you stumbled onto my land half dead and completely lost, and everything changed. He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. You gave me a reason to care about the future instead of just surviving the present. You gave me Sarah. You gave me a family and a home instead of just a house and some land. You've stood beside me through every challenge we've faced. So no, I don't regret it. Not for 1 second. I'd make the same choice 1,000 times over. Clara leaned against his shoulder, watching their daughter chase a butterfly through the grass. I would too, she said softly. Make the same choice, I mean. Every time. As autumn arrived and the first frost touched the prairie, Clara realized she was pregnant again. She told Elias one evening after Sarah had gone to bed, and his joy was immediate and uncomplicated. They'd weathered so much together, loss and hardship, uncertainty and change. Another child felt like an affirmation, a vote of confidence in the future they were building. This pregnancy was easier than the first in some ways, harder in others. Clara knew what to expect now, which reduced the anxiety but also meant she couldn't romanticize what was coming. And caring for an active toddler while pregnant and managing a household was exhausting in ways she hadn't anticipated. But she had help now. The community that had formed around the depot meant other women nearby, other mothers who understood the challenges and offered support. Martha Turner came by weekly with her daughters. Mrs. Whitley remained a constant presence. Even some of the newer settler women, initially wary of the established ranchers, gradually became friends. On a crisp October afternoon, Clara stood in her kitchen surrounded by women, kneading bread, mending clothes, preserving food, watching children play in the yard. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter, with the comfortable chaos of community. This was what she'd needed without knowing it. Not just a husband and home, but a place in a larger tapestry of lives interconnected by proximity and necessity and growing affection. You've built something good here, Clara, Martha said, pausing in her knitting to look around the room. This wasn't here 2 years ago. You made this happen. We made it happen, Clara corrected. All of us together. No, Mrs. Whitley said firmly. Martha's right. You brought something to this community that was missing. You brought the idea that we could be more than just isolated families barely surviving, that we could actually live, actually thrive, if we worked together. Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion. She'd come to Wyoming broken and alone, expecting nothing beyond basic survival. Instead, she'd found love and family and purpose. She'd found a home not just in Elias's ranch house, but in the broader community they were all building together. As winter closed in again and the ranch prepared for the cold months ahead, Clara felt a sense of peace she'd never experienced before. Not the absence of challenges, there would always be challenges, but the confidence that whatever came, they would face it together. That she was no longer the lost woman stumbling through the wilderness, but someone who'd found her place and claimed it with both hands. The baby was due in March, as the first signs of spring began returning to the frozen landscape. They were ready this time. The nursery prepared. Mrs. Whitley on standby. The doctor in the new town just an hour's ride away. But more importantly, Clara was ready. Ready to bring another life into this wild, beautiful, unforgiving place. Ready to expand the family she'd built from nothing. Ready for whatever came next, knowing that she had the strength to face it and people who would stand beside her. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently outside and Sarah slept peacefully in her cradle, Clara and Elias sat by the fire reflecting on the year that had passed. So much had changed, so much had been hard, but they were still here, still standing, still choosing each other and this life every single day. Thank you, Clara said softly, for catching me when I fell, for everything that came after. Elias pulled her close, his hand resting on her swollen belly where their second child grew. Thank you for falling close enough for me to catch you, for choosing to stay, for building this life with me. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang its winter song, and inside, a family held each other close against the dark. They had survived the wilderness, survived loss and hardship and change, and they would continue surviving, continue building, continue choosing love and hope and community even when, especially when, it would be easier to give up. This was home, this was family, this was everything they'd fought for and everything they'd found. Hard-won and precious beyond measure, built on the foundation of one woman's desperate plea and one man's simple answer that had changed both their lives forever. The winter passed with a rhythm Clara had come to recognize, the daily work of survival punctuated by moments of unexpected grace. Sarah took her first steps on a January morning when the world outside was locked in ice, stumbling from Elias's arms to Clara's with a look of pure triumph on her small face. The railroad depot town, now officially named Bridger Junction, continued to grow despite the harsh weather, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys where there had been none the year before. And inside Clara, the second baby grew strong and active, making its presence known with kicks that sometimes took her breath away. But beneath the surface of daily life, Clara sensed something changing in Elias. He'd grown quieter as winter deepened, spending long hours staring at ledgers and maps, his expression troubled. When she asked what was wrong, he'd shake his head and say everything was fine, but Clara knew better. She'd learned to read the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when he thought she wasn't looking. Finally, on a bitter February night after Sarah had been put to bed, Clara confronted him directly. "Tell me what's bothering you, and don't say nothing, because I know you better than that." Elias set down the fence post he'd been pretending to work on and rubbed his face with both hands. "I got a letter from the bank in Cheyenne. They want to see me about the mortgage." Clara felt her stomach drop. "What about the mortgage?" "We're not in default or anything like that, but they're concerned about the railroad changing property values, about whether the ranch will remain viable with all the development happening." He stood and moved to the window, though there was nothing to see but darkness and snow. "They're talking about calling in the loan early or significantly increasing the interest rate. Can they do that? If they can justify it as protecting their investment, yes. And with everything in flux right now, they might be able to make that case." Elias turned back to her, and Clara saw real fear in his eyes for the first time since she'd known him. "Clara, if they call in the loan, we could lose everything. The ranch, the house, all of it." Clara's hand instinctively went to her belly, where the baby kicked as if sensing her anxiety. "How much time do we have?" "They want to meet next week, in Cheyenne." Elias returned to his chair and sank into it heavily. "I should go alone. You're 7 months pregnant, and the journey in this weather?" "I'm coming with you," Clara interrupted. "If we're fighting for our home, we fight together. Mrs. Whitley can watch Sarah." Clara, "No arguments, Elias. This is our future we're talking about. Our children's future. I'm coming." The journey to Cheyenne took 3 days through snow and cold that tested every bit of Clara's determination. She rode in the wagon wrapped in buffalo robes. Sarah left safely with Mrs. Whitley, who'd promised to spoil the little girl rotten. Elias had wanted to leave Clara behind, his worry evident in every glance he threw her way, but she'd been adamant. They'd built this life together, and they'd fight for it together. Cheyenne was a revelation after the isolation of ranch life. Streets bustled with activity despite the cold. Buildings rose 3 and 4 stories high, their windows glowing with gaslight. The noise and crowds made Clara's head spin after months of quiet prairie life, but she straightened her spine and walked beside Elias into the imposing stone building that housed the Territorial Bank. The banker, a Mr. Thornton, was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the expression of someone perpetually disappointed by the world. He greeted them with minimal courtesy and got straight to business. "Mr. Griffin, thank you for coming. I'll be direct. The bank has concerns about your ability to repay your mortgage given the changing economic landscape in your area." "My payments have been on time every month for 5 years," Elias said, his voice tight. "I've never missed one, never been late." "That's true, but past performance doesn't guarantee future results." Thornton shuffled papers on his desk without looking at them. "The railroad has destabilized property values. New settlers are flooding in, competing for resources. The bank needs assurance that your operation will remain profitable enough to service your debt." Clara spoke up. "Mr. Thornton, may I ask you something?" The banker looked at her with barely concealed annoyance. "Yes, Mrs. Griffin? Have you ever been to our ranch? Seen our operation?" "I don't see how that's relevant." "It's entirely relevant," Clara interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "You're making judgments about our viability without any first-hand knowledge of what we've built. You're looking at numbers on paper without understanding the reality they represent." Thornton's expression soured further. "Mrs. Griffin, I appreciate your concern for your home, but banking decisions are made on financial data, not sentiment." "Then let's talk about financial data." Clara opened the satchel she'd brought and pulled out the ledgers Elias had been maintaining for years. Our cattle numbers have increased by 40% over the past 2 years. Our breeding program has improved the quality of our stock, which commands premium prices. The railroad depot has reduced our shipping costs by 60% while opening new markets. We're not struggling, Mr. Thornton. We're thriving. She spread the ledgers on his desk, pointing to specific entries. Here's our income from last year's cattle sales. Here's our expenses, which include regular mortgage payments made without fail. Here's our projected income for this year based on current herd size and market prices. The railroad hasn't destabilized us. It's made us stronger. Thornton examined the ledgers, his expression shifting from dismissive to grudgingly interested. These numbers are better than I expected, but they're also past performance. What about future risks? Every business has risks, Elias said, finding his voice again. But we've proven we can adapt. When the railroad threatened our grazing land, we negotiated. When new settlers arrived, we found ways to coexist. We don't just survive changes, Mr. Thornton. We use them to get stronger. And you have something most operations don't, Clara added, a diversified approach. We're not just raising cattle. We've started breeding horses for the Army outpost at Fort Bridger. We're selling milk and butter to the families at Bridger Junction. We've planted crops that we're selling at the new general store. We've built relationships with every business in the area, which means we have multiple revenue streams instead of depending on just one. Thornton sat back in his chair, studying them both. You've clearly put thought into this. We've put our lives into this, Clara said quietly. That ranch isn't just a business to us. It's our home. It's where we're raising our daughter and where we'll raise this child. She gestured to her swollen belly. It's where we've built a community and a future. So yes, we've put thought into it. We've put everything into it. The banker was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Finally, he spoke. I'll need to present this to the board, but based on what you've shown me, I'm prepared to recommend that we continue your current mortgage terms without modification. Your operation appears sound, and your planning is more sophisticated than most ranchers I've dealt with. Clara felt relief so intense it made her dizzy. Elias reached over and squeezed her hand, his grip almost painful. However, Thornton continued, I want quarterly reports going forward, detailed accounting of income, expenses, and herd numbers. If your situation changes, I need to know immediately. Can you commit to that? Absolutely, Elias said. Whatever you need. Good. Thornton gathered up the ledgers and handed them back to Clara. Mrs. Griffin, I underestimated you. That was a mistake I won't make again. Your financial acumen is impressive. I learned from necessity, Clara said. The frontier teaches you quickly or buries you. As they left the bank and walked back to their hotel through the snowy streets, Elias pulled Clara close. You saved us again. If I'd come alone, I would have accepted whatever terms Thornton offered, just grateful they weren't calling in the loan entirely. But you fought for us. I fought for our family, Clara corrected, for the life we've built and the future we're creating. I won't let anyone take that away from us without a fight. That night in their hotel room, as they lay together listening to the unfamiliar sounds of city life beyond the window, Elias wrapped his arms around Clara from behind, his hand resting on her belly. I love you, he said simply. I don't say it enough, but I need you to know. You're the strongest person I've ever met, Clara Griffin, the bravest, the smartest. I'm just stubborn, Clara said, but her voice was warm with affection. Too stubborn to let the world tell me what I can or cannot do. That's not stubbornness, that's strength. Elias kissed her shoulder. When you stumbled onto my ranch 2 years ago, you were broken and lost. Look at you now. You negotiate with railroad men and bankers. You run a household and help run a ranch. You're raising our daughter and carrying our son. Or daughter, Clara interrupted. Or daughter, Elias agreed. The point is, you've become someone I don't think you even knew you could be. And watching that transformation has been the greatest privilege of my life. Clara turned in his arms to face him. I didn't transform into someone new. I just finally became who I was always meant to be. The attack, losing my family, walking through that wilderness, It stripped away everything I thought I had to be and left only what I actually was underneath. And what I was, what I am, is someone who survives, someone who builds, someone who fights for what matters. And what matters? Elias asked softly. This, Clara said simply. You, Sarah. This baby. Our home, our community, all of it. That's what matters. That's what I'll keep fighting for as long as I draw breath. They made love slowly, carefully, mindful of Clara's pregnancy, but needing to reaffirm their connection after the stress of the day. Afterward, as Elias drifted toward sleep, Clara lay awake thinking about the journey that had brought her here. From the terrified survivor stumbling through the wilderness to the woman who'd just negotiated with a banker to save her family's future. The transformation was almost incomprehensible when she looked back at it. But perhaps that was the point. Life transformed everyone, whether they wanted it or not. The choice wasn't whether you changed, but how you changed. Whether you let tragedy break you or forge you into something stronger. Clara had been broken once, shattered into pieces by loss and trauma. But she'd been put back together, not into her original form, but into something new, something harder and more resilient, tempered by fire into steel. The journey back to the ranch took 4 days because Clara went into early labor on the second night. They were staying at a way station, a small building that offered shelter to travelers, when the contractions started. They were mild at first, easy to dismiss as false labor, but by midnight, Clara knew this was real. "We need to get you to a doctor," Elias said, panic evident in his voice. "There's no time," Clara gasped between contractions. "This baby's coming now." The way station keeper's wife, a capable woman named Ruth, who'd birthed 6 children of her own, took charge immediately. She sent Elias to boil water and gather clean cloths, then helped Clara onto the bed in the small back room. "First baby take long, but second babies have their own schedule," Ruth said calmly, examining Clara with experienced hands. "This one's in a hurry. How far apart are your pains?" 5 minutes, maybe less." "Then we'd best get ready. You've done this before, so you know what's coming. Just breathe through it and push when I tell you." The labor was faster than Sarah's had been, but no less intense. Clara gripped Ruth's hands and pushed when instructed, Elias hovering anxiously nearby. The way station was crude compared to their ranch house, and the circumstances were far from ideal, but Clara found herself drawing strength from the simple capability of Ruth's presence. This was frontier life, making do with what you had, relying on the kindness of strangers, bringing new life into the world wherever and however it arrived. Their son was born just before dawn, emerging into Ruth's waiting hands with a lusty cry that announced his arrival to anyone within hearing distance. He was smaller than Sarah had been, but perfectly formed and clearly healthy despite his early entrance. "A boy," Ruth announced, placing him on Clara's chest. "A strong one, too. Listen to those lungs." Elias knelt beside the bed, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son. "He's perfect. Clara, he's absolutely perfect." "Thomas," Clara said softly, naming him after her lost brother. "His name is Thomas." They stayed at the way station for a week while Clara recovered enough to travel. Ruth treated them like family, refusing payment beyond what Elias insisted on leaving as thanks. Other travelers came and went, offering congratulations and sharing their own stories of frontier childbirth. Clara listened to these tales of babies born in wagons and tents, in barns and open prairie, and felt part of something larger than herself. This was the reality of building a new world, messy, unplanned, full of hardship, but also full of stubborn, relentless life. When they finally made it home, Mrs. Whitley had the house prepared and Sarah waiting impatiently to meet her baby brother. The little girl was fascinated by Thomas, wanting to touch his tiny hands and watch him sleep. Clara watched her daughter's wonder and felt her heart expand to accommodate this new love without diminishing what she felt for Sarah or Elias. Love wasn't a finite resource that had to be divided, she realized. It multiplied, grew, expanded to fill whatever space you gave it. Spring arrived properly in April, transforming the brown prairie into an ocean of green dotted with wildflowers. Clara emerged from the exhausting early weeks of caring for a newborn to find the world renewed. The ranch work demanded attention, calving season, branding, preparing for summer grazing. But there was also time for gentler pursuits. Clara expanded her garden, planting not just vegetables but flowers for the sheer joy of beauty. She taught Sarah to gather eggs from the chicken coop, the 2-year-old taking her responsibilities with adorable seriousness. One afternoon in May, as Clara sat on the porch nursing Thomas while watching Sarah play in the yard, she saw riders approaching. 3 women on horseback, all dressed in practical riding clothes, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. As they drew closer, Clara recognized Martha Turner and 2 of the newer settler wives she'd become friendly with. "Thought you might need some help," Martha called out as they dismounted. "Spring cleaning time, and you've got your hands full with that new baby." "I can't ask you to," Clara started. "You didn't ask. We offered." Martha climbed the porch steps and peered at Thomas. "He's beautiful, Clara. Looks like his father around the eyes." The women spent the day helping with all the accumulated work that had piled up during Clara's recovery. They washed curtains and beat rugs, organized the pantry and scrubbed floors. They cooked enough food to fill the larder for a week. And through it all, they talked, sharing stories, offering advice, building the bonds of friendship that made frontier life bearable. As they prepared to leave that evening, one of the newer wives, a young woman named Elizabeth, spoke hesitantly. "Mrs. Griffin, Clara, I wanted to thank you." "For what?" Clara asked, surprised. "For showing me that it's possible to make a real life here. When we first arrived, I was terrified. Everything seemed so hard, so impossible. But watching you, seeing how you've built this home, raised your children, contributed to the community, it gave me hope that maybe I could do it too." Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion. "You absolutely can do it. We all can if we help each other. That's the secret, I think. None of us is strong enough to do this alone, but together, we're unstoppable." After the women left, Elias found Clara still on the porch, Thomas asleep in her arms, watching the sun set over the prairie. He settled beside her, pulling her close. "That was good, what happened today," he said. "Women helping women. Building something real." "It's what I've always needed," Clara admitted. "When I first came here, I thought I just needed safety and shelter. But what I really needed was this: belonging, purpose, community. A place where I matter not just as someone's wife or someone's mother, but as myself." "You've always mattered," Elias said gently, "from the very first day." Clara smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. "I know, but I had to learn to see it for myself. Had to learn that I was worth saving, worth keeping, worth loving. That was the hardest lesson the frontier taught me." That summer brought changes both large and small. The Cattlemen's Association expanded, adding new members as more ranchers settled in the territory. The railroad completed its line, and the first locomotive steamed through Bridger Junction to cheers and celebrations. Clara attended the ceremony with Thomas strapped to her back and Sarah holding Elias's hand, watching history unfold before them. The town continued to grow, and with it came institutions Clara had never expected to see on the frontier. A proper school opened in August, with a young teacher from Philadelphia hired to educate the area's children. A church was built, its white steeple visible for miles across the flat prairie. A newspaper started publication, documenting the transformation of wilderness into civilization. But some things remained unchanged. The land still demanded constant work and attention. The weather still turned deadly without warning. Livestock still died. Crops still failed, and the frontier still extracted its price from those who called it home. The difference was that now there were more people to share the burden, more hands to help when trouble came, more voices to laugh with in good times, and comfort in bad. On a September evening, as the first hints of autumn colored the air, Clara stood in the doorway of the small schoolhouse watching Sarah attend her first day of class. Her daughter sat straight-backed at a wooden desk, slate and chalk in front of her, listening intently as Miss Peterson explained the alphabet. Clara felt tears threatening as she watched, thinking about how far they'd all come. "She looks so grown up," Mrs. Whitley said, appearing beside Clara. "Seems like yesterday she was just learning to walk." "They grow so fast," Clara agreed. "I want to hold on to every moment, but they just keep slipping away." "That's the nature of time, child. It moves whether we want it to or not. The trick is making sure the moments matter while you have them." Clara thought about that as she walked back to the ranch, Thomas sleeping peacefully against her chest. Making moments matter. That's what she'd been doing since the day Elias caught her before she fell. Creating moments worth remembering, building a life worth living, transforming survival into something that felt like grace. That winter was milder than previous years, which the old-timers claim meant a harsh one was coming the next year. But for now, they were grateful for the reprieve. Clara spent the long evenings teaching Sarah to read, the little girl sounding out words with fierce concentration. Thomas grew strong and healthy, already trying to crawl at 5 months old. Elias built new furniture and made plans for spring expansion. And Clara, for the first time in her adult life, felt something approaching contentment. But contentment doesn't mean the absence of challenge. In January, a letter arrived from Aunt Margaret. Clara opened it with trembling hands, unsure what to expect after nearly 3 years of minimal contact. My dearest Clara, I write to you with news both sad and hopeful. I have been ill this past year, nothing immediately life-threatening, but serious enough to force me to confront my own mortality. In doing so, I have reflected deeply on our correspondence and your choices. I was wrong, Clara. Wrong to push so hard for you to come to Boston. Wrong to believe that respectability and comfort were more important than purpose and joy. Wrong to dismiss your choice of life as reckless or misguided. Your letters these past years have shown me a woman I didn't know existed, strong, capable, fulfilled in ways I never imagined possible. You have built something real and valuable, and I am proud of you beyond measure. I am leaving you my estate and my will, not because I expect you to return to Boston, but because I want you to have the security and options that money provides. Use it to expand your ranch, to ensure your children's education, to build whatever future you envision. It is my way of saying that I support your choice, even if I cannot fully understand it. Please write when you can. Tell me about your children, your life, your hopes. I want to know the woman you have become, not the girl I remember from so long ago. With love and deep respect, Aunt Margaret Clara read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. This unexpected blessing felt like a final release from the weight of others' expectations. Her aunt, the woman who had represented everything proper and conventional, had acknowledged that Clara's unconventional path had value. "What does it say?" Elias asked gently, seeing her tears. Clara handed him the letter and watched his face as he read. When he finished, he looked at her with wonder. "This changes things. With this kind of inheritance, we could expand significantly, buy more land, increase the herds, maybe even—" "Build a school," Clara interrupted. "A real school, bigger than the one-room building in town, with proper books and supplies, something that would serve the whole community." Elias studied her face. "That's what you want? Not security for our family?" "Our family is secure," Clara said firmly. "We've built that ourselves and we'll maintain it ourselves. But a school, that's something that could benefit everyone. That could help shape the future of this entire territory. My father always wanted better education for his children. Building a school would honor that dream." "Your father would be proud of you," Elias said softly. "So would your mother and Tommy. They'd see what you've built here and know that their sacrifice wasn't in vain." Clara had learned not to flinch from the pain of remembering her lost family. Instead, she'd learned to carry them with her, to let their memory inform her choices rather than paralyze her with grief. "I hope so," she said quietly. "I hope they'd understand why I chose this life." Plans for the school consumed the next months. Clara worked with the Cattlemen's Association and the growing town council to identify a location and draw up specifications. She corresponded with educational suppliers in the East, ordering books and materials. She interviewed teacher candidates, looking for someone who understood that frontier children needed practical skills as well as book learning. The school was finished in September, just in time for the new academic year. It was a beautiful building, constructed from local timber and stone, with large windows to let in light and a wood stove that would keep students warm through the winter. The dedication ceremony drew people from ranches and homesteads across hundreds of square miles, all gathering to celebrate this milestone in their community's development. Clara stood beside Elias and their children, watching as the mayor of Bridger Junction cut the ribbon. Sarah, now 4 years old, was bouncing with excitement about attending the new school. Thomas, toddling on unsteady legs, was more interested in the horses tied up nearby. Clara held both of them close and thought about the journey that had brought her here. "What are you thinking?" Elias asked, reading her expression. "I'm thinking about how strange life is. How the worst day of my life led to the best days of my life. How I had to lose everything before I could find what really mattered. Do you ever wish you could go back? Change what happened? Clara considered the question seriously. If I could save my family, of course I would. But I can't. What I can do is honor their memory by living fully, by building something meaningful, by choosing hope over grief. She looked up at him. You taught me that. You showed me that survival isn't enough. We have to create meaning from the pain. The dedication ceremony concluded with a meal shared community style, everyone contributing what they could. Clara moved through the crowd, greeting friends and neighbors, watching her children play with other ranch kids. This was her tribe now, her people, not connected by blood but by shared experience, mutual support, and the bonds forged in the crucible of frontier life. As autumn deepened into winter and the third anniversary of Clara's arrival at the ranch approached, she found herself reflecting on all that had changed. The terrified, broken woman who'd collapsed into Elias's arms seemed like someone from another lifetime. In her place was a woman who negotiated with railroad executives and bankers, who helped run a successful ranch, who'd become a pillar of her community. A mother, a wife, a leader. Someone who mattered. On the exact anniversary of the day they'd met, Elias surprised Clara with a gift. He led her outside after dinner, Sarah and Thomas already asleep, and gestured toward the barn. There, he'd hung a hand-carved sign that read, Griffin Ranch, SM 1868, home of the Griffin family. I wanted something permanent, Elias explained, something that would last beyond us, that would tell people who come after us that we were here, that we built this, that we mattered. Clara traced the carved letters with her fingers, emotion thick in her throat. We did matter. We do matter. Not because of what we built or what we accomplished, but because we chose each other, because we chose to keep living when it would have been easier to give up. Elias pulled her close, and they stood together in the starlight, looking at their home. Do you remember what you said to me that first day, after I caught you? I said a lot of things. I was delirious. You said you could work, that you needed to earn your keep. Elias smiled at the memory. And I told you no, you could rest beside me. Do you remember what you thought when I said that? Clara did remember. She'd thought he was crazy or naive or too kind for the harsh frontier. She'd been certain that nothing came free, that every debt had to be repaid. I thought you didn't understand how the world worked. And now? Now I think you understood exactly how the world worked. But you chose to create something different. A place where people could rest without earning it, where help was freely given, where family wasn't just blood but choice. Clara turned in his arms to face him. You built that before I ever arrived. I just helped you expand it. We built it together, Elias corrected. Everything we have, everything we are. We built it together. They stood in comfortable silence, watching their children sleep through the window, smoke curling from the chimney into the star-filled Wyoming sky. The ranch stretched around them in all directions, familiar and beloved. This land that had nearly killed Clara had become her salvation, her home, her future. Years passed, each one adding new chapters to their story. Sarah grew tall and smart, graduating at the top of her class from the school Clara had built. Thomas became his father's shadow, learning ranching from the moment he could sit a horse. 2 more children joined the family, another daughter named Grace, and finally a son they called William, after Elias's father. The ranch prospered beyond their early dreams. The cattle operation expanded, the horse breeding program gained regional recognition, and the Griffin name became synonymous with quality and reliability. But more importantly, the community Clara had helped build flourished. The school educated hundreds of children. The Cattlemen's Association successfully advocated for ranchers' interests in territorial politics. Bridger Junction grew from a cluster of buildings around a depot into a proper town with churches and businesses and civic institutions. Clara watched it all with satisfaction and some amazement. She'd arrived in Wyoming with nothing, no family, no possessions, no future. She'd built a life beyond anything she'd imagined possible. Not alone, never alone, but alongside people who'd chosen to stand with her, to build with her, to create something larger than any individual could accomplish. Mrs. Whitley, now in her 70s, still came by weekly, though she moved slower and complained more about her joints. Martha Turner's hair had gone completely gray, but her spirit remained undimmed. Some of the original ranchers had moved on or passed away, but new families had arrived to take their places, continuing the endless cycle of frontier life. On a summer evening 15 years after Clara had stumbled onto the Griffin Ranch, the family gathered on the porch for supper. Sarah, now 19 and teaching at the school her mother had founded, was home visiting. Thomas, at 13, was already nearly as tall as his father. Grace and William chased fireflies in the yard, their laughter carrying across the prairie. Elias and Clara sat together in the rocking chairs he'd built years ago, watching their children and grandchildren. Sarah had married young and feeling the weight of accumulated years and accumulated blessings. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Clara asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "When I showed up more dead than alive?" "I think about it all the time," Elias admitted. "I think about how close I came to not being there that day. I'd considered riding to town for supplies. If I had, you would have collapsed with no one to catch you. Someone else would have found me eventually. Maybe, or maybe not. The frontier is full of graves of people who fell in the wrong place at the wrong time." Elias reached for her hand. "I was in the right place at the right time, for both of us." Clara squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses earned through decades of hard work, the strength that had never faltered. "You know what the most remarkable thing is? Not that you caught me that day, but that you've been catching me every day since. Every time I doubted myself, every time I was afraid, every time life felt too hard. You were there." "That's what we do," Elias said simply. "We catch each other, always have, always will." As the sun set over the Wyoming prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara felt a profound sense of peace. She'd survived when survival seemed impossible. She'd built a life when she'd had nothing to build with. She'd found love in the midst of loss, hope in the aftermath of tragedy, home in the wilderness that had tried to kill her. The girl who'd begged to work, desperate to prove her worth, was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her value, who'd claimed her place in the world through determination and grace and stubborn refusal to be defeated. A woman who'd learned that the strongest thing you could do wasn't surviving alone. It was choosing to build a life with others, to create community from isolation, to transform tragedy into something that looked remarkably like triumph. "I love you," Clara said softly, the words carrying the weight of 15 years of marriage, 4 children, countless challenges overcome, and a lifetime of moments that mattered. "I love you too," Elias replied, pulling her close. "Thank you for falling onto my land. Thank you for staying. Thank you for building this life with me." Their children's laughter echoed across the prairie as darkness fell and stars emerged overhead. The ranch house glowed with lamplight, a beacon of warmth and safety in the vast Wyoming night. Inside those walls were memories and dreams, love and labor, everything that made a house into a home and a collection of individuals into a family. Clara closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of her life. Elias's steady breathing, children's voices, wind through grass, the distant call of a coyote. These were the sounds of home, of survival, of purpose fulfilled. She'd walked through fire to get here, had lost everything and found something better. She'd been caught when she fell and had spent every day since grateful for those strong arms and that steady voice saying, "I've got you." And he had. Through everything, he had. Just as she'd had him, catching him in return, building their life together one choice at a time, one day at a time, one moment at a time. This was their story, a tale of loss and love, of wilderness and home, of 2 people who'd found each other against impossible odds and built something that would last long after they were gone. The Griffin Ranch would stand for generations, a testament to what could be created when people chose hope over despair, community over isolation, love over fear. As Clara drifted towards sleep that night, Elias's arms around her and the sound of their home settling into darkness, her last conscious thought was simple and profound. "I survived. I lived. I loved. And that was enough. That was everything." The Wyoming stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, shining down on a ranch house where a family slept secure in the knowledge that they'd built something worth keeping, something worth fighting for, something that would endure long after their individual stories had ended. And in the morning, they would wake and do it all again. Not because it was easy, but because it was theirs. Their life, their choice, their love. hard-won and precious beyond measure, forged in the crucible of the frontier and tempered by years of challenges overcome together. This was home, this was family, this was everything they'd survived to find, and it was worth every hard step of the journey that had brought them here.